Chapter 8:15. According to the new storyline, before Vesper died, he gave a necklace to Bond. On the pendant of the necklace was a photo of Vesper and his sister, Angela. Bond used the pendant and other clues left by Vesper to figure out the ins and outs of the matter and began his revenge to rescue Angela Linda. On the other hand, Charlie's detective agency had been looking for girls with special abilities from all over the world to join the Angel Corps. Angela Linda, who was obsessed with delicate mechanical design under the influence of her father, a senior mechanical engineer, entered the field of vision of Charlie's detective agency. Charlie's detective agency used their foundation to provide Angela Linda with a scholarship and trained her as a key angel. After the story of Casino Royale began, Angela Lynn was kidnapped by the Spectre underworld organization to force Vesper Lynn to hand over the $150 million that Bond had won in gambling. Angela Linda's disappearance attracted the attention of Charlie's detective agency. Selena, Jill, and Lucchini happened to be in the United Kingdom and received the mission to find out where Angela Linda went. Because of this storyline, Charlie's detective agency, which did not belong to the government, was involved in the Ghost Gang, and the MGM agent movie universe officially became one. In the third script of Charlie's Angels that was being conceived, there would be a side plot where the Ghost Gang pursued the Angel Corps in order to take revenge on Charlie's detective agency. In the end, Charlie's detective agency was forced to cooperate with the government to launch a joint counterattack against the Ghost Gang. After Eric and Roger Wilson confirmed their intention to acquire ARM, the next acquisition negotiations were taken over by Chris. Over the years, through various equity incentives and other means, although Eric had been continuously injecting large amounts of money into Firefly Investment Company, Chris's shareholding in Firefly Investment Company had always been maintained at the 3% that Eric had promised. This shareholding percentage seemed a bit insignificant, but according to the current asset scale of Firefly Investment Company, Chris's net worth had exceeded $600 million. If the news was made public, Chris would definitely become the professional manager with the highest average annual salary in North America. In the next few years, as the Nasdaq index exploded, the value of this 3% equity would easily increase by more than 10 times. It would not be surprising if it reached $10 billion. Of course, the market value of the entire Firefly Investment Company would be even more terrifying by then. Chris had seen Firefly Investments grow step by step with his own eyes. Naturally, he was well aware of the value of the 3% shares. His outstanding workability was also worthy of Eric's remuneration. Thus, Eric decided to be a hands-off manager, determine the general direction of the company's development, and entrust the specific but minor affairs to Chris. After solving the problem with ARM, Eric devoted himself to the final stage of Casino Royale. Kate, Charlize, and Penelope joined the cast the following week and began filming the crossover storyline. After a few years of experience, the three girls had completely shed their initial naivety. They didn't have many scenes, and everything was progressing very smoothly. While Eric was shooting the main plot related to Bond, an assistant director took Kate and the other two girls to Italy to make up for some of the scenes that were left behind because the three girls couldn't move their schedules. The final scene of this version of Casino Royale was set on an island in the English Channel. However, the crew didn't go to the island for the actual shooting. Except for the necessary outdoor scenes, most of the scenes were still shot in the studio of Pinewood Studio. After Vesper's death, Bond followed all kinds of clues and finally found the Spectre's lair on a small island in the English Channel. Angela Linda was also trapped here. On the other hand, Selena and the other two girls arrived at the island almost at the same time as Bond. The security on the island was very tight. The purpose of the three girls was purely to save people, and they didn't intend to confront the Ghost Gang head-on. Therefore, they sneaked in through the ventilation duct and tried to save Angela Linda silently. Bond, on the other hand, was different. While rescuing Angela Linda, Bond was also thinking of revenge, so he killed his way into the base. At the same time, because he inadvertently restrained a large number of villains, he inadvertently helped Selena and the other two rescue Angela more successfully. At the same time, because Bond made a scene in the base, the passage that the Angel group used to sneak in was accidentally blown up, and they had to leave through the main entrance. This also caused Bond's first head-on encounter with Charlie's Angel. The scene was very exciting and even a little erotic. The two sides didn't know each other, so they naturally fought after encountering each other. The thought of James Bond fighting against the Thunderbolt girls made one's blood boil. A long time ago, after Eric confirmed this plot, he had already decided to edit the relevant scenes into the trailer in the future. Of course, good ideas were often not so easy to shoot. According to the detailed plot design, after Bond killed his way into the base, he would first meet Selina, who was in charge of clearing the way. In such an urgent situation, the two sides had no chance to explain to each other and started to fight almost as soon as they met. As the strongest of the trio, Selina's combat prowess had been fully displayed in the previous two works. In fact, if they were to fight seriously, according to the detailed design, if the two sides fought with their lives, Bond might not be able to defeat Selina with only his fists and feet. Of course, they couldn't be so calculative in the actual shooting. Although Bond's fighting scenes in the past 007 movies had never been any highlight, as a top agent of the MI6, he was naturally not weak. Moreover, Bond was a man with a height of more than 190 centimeters. In front of Selina, who was a relatively petite woman, he naturally had a huge advantage. According to the principle of a strong man can defeat 10 skilled men, the two of them should be evenly matched in the fight. Pine Forest Film Studio 007. During the 2 days of shooting, the studio was very lively. As the most popular female action movie in recent years, The Thunderbolt Girls was not much less famous than 007. Therefore, the scene of Bond fighting against the Thunderbolt Girls naturally attracted a lot of attention. Anyone who had access to the studio would basically be there these 2 days. The scene in front of them was the corner of a corridor. Bond killed his way in, and the three girls with Angela Lynn came out one after another. The two sides met here. In order to achieve a better effect, the three girls certainly wouldn't appear together. Selina would encounter Bond first, and the two would take the risk of a most classic fight scene for this movie. Eric's requirements for Selina's actions in this scene were to be straightforward and fierce. He discussed with the action director for a long time and finally decided that in order to make this fight scene more pleasing to the eye, they would greatly increase the display of Selina's leg techniques. After all, as a woman, even if Selina's punch against a tall and strong man like Bond had an actual attack effect, it still didn't look very convincing. However, the effect of her leg techniques was completely different. A fight scene usually looked like it was completed in one go on screen, but the actual shooting needed to be done shot by shot. In front of the monitor in the set, Eric, the cameraman, Nickel, the action director of the crew, and the Broccoli siblings, who had rushed over to join in the fun, watched the replay of the scene just now. After discussing for a while, he called Pierce Brosnan and Kate Beckinsale, who were resting, over. "Pierce, Kate, we have to reshoot the scene just now," Eric said as he pressed the replay button and began to explain in detail the requirements for the reshoot. "Pierce, if you simply press Kate against the wall, I'm afraid it will be very difficult to control her. Therefore, I hope that when Kate performs a high whip kick, Pierce, you can grab her ankle and push her against the wall." As Eric spoke, he ignored the strange expressions of Pierce Brosnan and Kate. He turned his head and said to the action director from Hong Kong, "Mr. Yuan, please demonstrate it to Miss Lee." "Okay," the other party nodded and responded. He called over an Asian girl who had a similar figure to Kate. She was the stunt double that the crew had found for Kate. Looking at the demonstration, Kate, who was standing beside Eric, couldn't help but roll her eyes at him. She whispered, "Eric, don't you think this is a little too intimate?" Eric smiled and said, "What we want is to create a sense of Bond and Selina as a couple for the audience. If the audience's response is good in the future, we can set up more interactions between Selina and Bond in the future episodes." Kate frowned slightly and said, "Are you saying that Bond and Selina will be a couple?" "That's not necessarily true. Maybe the future episodes will satisfy the audience's wishes. But before that, it's best for Bond and Selina to maintain an ambiguous relationship. Many facts have proven that this is the best effect." "But," Kate looked again at Miss Lee, who had easily completed the high kick. Eric followed Kate's gaze and asked in a low voice, "Have you been slacking off on your training in the past 2 years?" Kate's face was a little red. Although she had never given up on training for this role, with her popularity in the past 2 years, she could no longer train as hard as when Eric had first arranged for her. Eric thought for a moment and asked, If this scene is taken apart, can you complete the split? Kate thought for a moment and nodded. Okay, then let's do it this way. Eric walked forward and discussed with the action director for a while. After confirming a set of plans, the shooting continued. As Eric asked the crew to prepare for the next scene, the extras who were playing the villains found their positions and lay on the ground. This was the result of the confrontation between Bond and the villains. The first part of the dismantling was quickly completed. After a little preparation, the script director shouted, "Action," again. In the camera, Kate swept a high kick at Pierce with an expressionless face. Pierce Brosnan reached out to grab it, but to his surprise, he grabbed nothing but air. Kate's hard-soled leather boot swept across his face. Although Kate's kick was not very powerful, Pierce Brosnan still looked a little embarrassed. Eric walked forward and watched the medical staff examine Pierce Brosnan. He asked, "Pierce, do you need to rest for a while?" "No." Pierce Brosnan shook his head and looked at the apologetic Kate. He smiled gracefully and said, "It's okay, Kate. Don't take it to heart." It was inevitable to take a few punches and kicks while filming an action scene. Seeing that Pierce Brosnan was fine, Eric quickly restarted the shoot. After a few more mistakes, Pierce Brosnan finally completed the set actions successfully. Selina, who was wearing a black patent leather bodysuit, had one leg raised high and was pressed tightly against the wall by Bond, unable to move. The camera deliberately gave a close-up of the two of them looking at each other. After a difficult struggle, Bond finally subdued the strong, little wild cat in front of him. Bond's expression was inevitably a little ferocious. Although Selina was subdued by her opponent, she did not panic at all. Her face was still calm and indifferent. However, at this time, because the two of them were entangled in a somewhat flirtatious manner, the look in the camera gave off a feeling of sparks flying everywhere. There was the sound of footsteps. The strange stalemate between the two of them was soon broken by the appearance of Jill and the others. Seeing that Selina was subdued by Bond, Jill immediately raised her pistol and pointed it at Bond. Almost at the same time, Bond freed one hand and simply took out a pistol from the holster at his waist and pointed it at Jill. Both of them probably realized that something was wrong, so they did not communicate, nor did they have any intention of fighting again. Lucaini held Angela's hand and stood outside the three of them. She happened to be able to see the two intersecting corridors. Glancing at the Ghost Gang minions on the two corridors, Lucaini said, "Hey, everyone, why do I suddenly feel like we're on the same side?" Jill was standing in a similar position as Lucaini. At this time, she also noticed the similar scene on the two corridors. The minions on their side had just been killed by Selina, and on the other side, it was definitely this person in front of them. Since they had a common enemy, Jill slowly put down the gun in her hand. Although Bond was still vigilant, he had already recognized Angela. Noticing that Lucaini was protecting Angela behind her, Bond slowly let go of Selina. Glancing at Selina and the other two girls, Bond took out Vesper's necklace from his pocket and handed it to Angela. "Your sister asked me to save you." Angela took the necklace with a puzzled expression. She was a very smart girl. At this time, she had already realized that the recent series of events were unusual. The girl looked up at Bond and asked, "Where's my sister?" Bond's expression was a little gloomy. However, before he could explain, footsteps sounded in the distance again. "Take her away. I'll look for you." Bond vigilantly took out his pistol from his waist. Selina and the other two girls only wanted to save Selina and did not intend to fight to the death with the Ghost Gang. It was their first time meeting Bond, and they could not fight side by side with him for no reason. Therefore, they decisively retreated. Raising his gun, Bond wiped out a few of the minions who had reappeared and went straight for the villain who had killed Vesper Rinda, intending to put an end to everything. Chapter 8:16. On the beach road near the sea. A black Buick was parked by the side of the road. Lucaini was sitting casually in the front of the car with her legs crossed, looking sexy and lazy. Selina and Jill were also leaning against the car. The three women were wearing similar tight clothes. Their stunning faces and figures were enough to make any man who saw this scene want to be the Buick next to them. At this moment, the three women looked at the two people who were saying goodbye not far away. A man and a woman, one big and one small. It was Bond and Angela. Everything had been settled. As Vesper's lover, Bond wanted to take care of Angela, but he also knew that his wandering and dangerous life would not provide Angela with a peaceful life. Instead, it would put her in danger. After some consideration, Bond decided to entrust Angela to Charlie's detective agency. This was also the girl's request. In the camera, Angela had roughly understood the ins and outs of everything. The girl handed the necklace to Bond again and said, "I think you might need this more than me." Bond took the necklace and hesitated for a moment before holding it in his hand. He said to Angela, then, "Take good care of yourself. I'll come back to see you when I'm free." "Okay." Angela nodded obediently. Bond didn't delay. He nodded at Selina and the other two and turned to walk back to his Aston Martin. Angela looked at Bond's departing figure and suddenly thought of something very important. She asked loudly, "Hey, you haven't told me your name yet." Bond raised a hand and waved, but didn't look back. He said, "Bond, James Bond." When Pierce Brosnan said this iconic line that would appear in every 007 movie, Eric smiled and nodded outside the camera. He raised his voice and said, "Good, I officially announce that 007 Casino Royale has finished filming." Everyone who had specially gathered for today's scene clapped spontaneously. They nodded, hugged, and said goodbye to the people around them. Eric shook hands with Michael Wilson and hugged Barbara Broccoli. He said, "Barbara, I hope we'll have a chance to work together again." "Of course, I'm looking forward to the next one," Barbara Broccoli said with a smile. After almost a year, the Broccoli family had basically accepted the fact that the control of the 007 series was taken back by MGM and no longer entangled with this point. After all, although they lost control, the Broccoli family's share of the 007 series was not reduced by MGM. Eric personally controlled the series, which could bring more benefits to the Broccoli family. After chatting with Barbara Broccoli for a while, Eric turned to Pierce Brosnan. After finishing Vesper's part, Kate Blanchett had already left the set. Without the pressure of Kate's acting, Pierce Brosnan's last few days were very relaxed. Some of the small conflicts that had accumulated in the early stages had disappeared. After talking to everyone in the crew one by one, the crew returned from the beach to Pine Forest Film Studio, where they had already prepared a grand finalizing party. It was already November 3rd, and Halloween had just passed in North America. After the finalizing party, Eric returned to Los Angeles with the post-production team and the shooting materials of Casino Royale. There were only 2 weeks left before Thanksgiving Day, and the release date of Mission Impossible 2 was set to be on November 22nd. During the post-production process of Casino Royale, the first thing that Eric needed to complete was the Easter egg of Casino Royale embedded at the end of Mission Impossible 2. Since the Easter egg of 007's GoldenEye was added to the first Thunderbolts movie, this had become a tradition of the MGM Secret Agent Cinematic Universe series. While watching the movie, the majority of movie fans gradually began to have a strong interest in the Easter egg of every MGM Secret Agent Cinematic Universe series. In November, London had already entered winter. When Eric left, London had already had its first snow of the year. Los Angeles, located on the west coast of the United States, was still as warm as spring. The temperature during the day was maintained at a very comfortable 20 degrees. Even at night, the temperature did not drop below 10 degrees. Priya Vesta, Firefly Studios. Eric and the editor of Casino Royale came out of the post-production studio together. The editing of the Easter egg of a movie was not an easy task. Compared to the trailer, the duration of the Easter egg was much shorter. Often, there were only one or a few simple shots, almost flashing by. Therefore, how to provide enough information and suspense to the audience in the Easter egg without revealing the main plot was something that the director and the editor had to consider very carefully. Eric planned to set the menu of Mrs. M's introduction to 007 of the information of the Ghost Gang obtained from Ethan Hunt. However, the specific material needed to be carefully considered. He and the editor discussed it for 2 days before coming up with a roughly 10-second plan. It was already evening. After saying goodbye to the editor, Eric did not leave the studio immediately. Instead, He went to Jeffrey Katzenberg's office in the studio. At noon, Katzenberg called, hoping to talk about the release of the movie during the Thanksgiving and Christmas period. From Katzenberg's tone, Eric determined that it should be related to Titanic. At the end of the year, Firefly mainly released 2 films, New Line Productions' Rush Hour and Firefly's Titanic. Rush Hour had already gone through a few pre-screening screenings, and the reviews were good. The film was scheduled to be released on November 15th, and it was currently in the final stage of promotion. Moreover, the film's production cost was only $30 million, which was less than 1/7 of Titanic's budget. The company was not too worried about the film. When he arrived at Katzenberg's office, he waved his hand to stop the secretary from announcing him. He knocked on the door and entered. Katzenberg, who was immersed in reading documents, looked up when he saw Eric enter. He nodded and looked at his watch. He closed the document in front of him and said, "Eric, let's talk outside." The two left the administrative building and went all the way to the cafe in the studio. After ordering 2 cups of coffee and some snacks, Katzenberg said, "Eric, someone saw Jim West and Theo Jean-Ma eating together at Morton's restaurant yesterday." Before Eric could continue asking, Katzenberg explained, Jim West is the assistant of Paramount Shirley Lansing, and Theo Jean-Ma is a judge of the Golden Globe Awards Foreign Press Association. In fact, when he heard Theo Jean-Ma's name, Eric had already understood something. Theo Jean-Ma might just be an ordinary judge of the Golden Globe Awards now, but 10 years later, Theo Jean-Ma would become the youngest judge in the history of the Golden Globe Awards. "They're really looking forward to Firefly's failure," Eric shook his head and sighed. Eric knew that the company had recently been doing public relations for the nomination of Titanic for the Golden Globe Awards. The criteria for the Golden Globe Awards were similar to the Oscars. However, the Golden Globe Awards nominations were announced around December 10th every year. The large-scale release date of Titanic was December 20th. Before that, although there would be a few pre-screenings to meet the criteria for the Golden Globe Awards, if they really wanted to be nominated, they still needed to do public relations work. In the past, other Hollywood film companies rarely carried out reverse public relations for their competitors' works. This was because once they did, they would definitely be retaliated in the future. In the competition for awards, the more aggressive competitive methods were usually to find the weaknesses of their competitors' works and attack them in the media to prevent the judges from voting for a work. It was rare for Titanic to do the reverse public relations for Titanic this year. Eric also knew that Firefly had suppressed the other major film companies too much in the past few years. Although the film market had been expanding, the scale was still roughly fixed. He could not suppress the box office performance of Firefly's own film just to take into account the feelings of his competitors. Carson's face was also a little serious. He said, "We're also trying our best to fight for it. However, in addition to Paramount, Warner Brothers, Universal, and a few other companies have also participated. Therefore, Titanic is likely to only get a few insignificant nominations at the Golden Globe Awards." "We can only try our best," Eric said. "In addition, we must not use any other extreme measures at this time. So many people are watching." After a moment of silence, Eric said, "If the box office of Titanic next month does not meet expectations, I will take the initiative to hold a high-level meeting to make a review. At the same time, we will discuss a stricter budget system for the company." "Eric, you don't need to review at all. The film company definitely needs to try out a big production. We just need to formulate a stricter budget system," Carson quickly shook his head and said. During the Disney era led by Michael Eisner, Carson had always been the head of the studio. At that time, a large part of Carson's work actually included taking the blame for Michael Eisner. Once the movie led by Michael Eisner failed, the criticism from the outside world would often directly press on Carson. In order to maintain Michael Eisner's prestige, Carson rarely explained anything to the public. Hollywood was a place that attached great importance to authority. If Eric took the initiative to review, it would definitely damage his personal prestige. Everyone knew very well that over the years, Eric had always been the soul of Firefly. Without his keen vision in film and television production, Firefly would not have been able to develop to its current scale. That's it for the time being. Eric shook his head and rejected Carson's kindness. He said, but before that, I hope that all departments will not be affected by external information. Try to market and distribute Titanic as much as possible. Since we can't get a good schedule overseas and those film companies want to lower the share, then let's talk about it after the movie is released. Once the North American box office did not meet expectations, Firefly would naturally need to lower the share for overseas distribution. Otherwise, the initiative would return to Firefly. No problem. I will personally keep an eye on this matter, Katzenberg promised solemnly. Chapter 8:17. After talking to Katzenberg about Titanic, Eric drove back to the Pointy Corner Manor. As dusk fell, Eric walked into the villa and walked through the hall to the glass wall. He saw Nicole sitting lazily on the sofa, reading a comic with relish. That's right, a comic. Beside the glass wall, there were thousands of comics of all kinds piled up around the sofa where Eric often rested. Back in the United States, while working on the post-production of Casino Royale, Eric also began to prepare for the Marvel Cinematic Universe in advance. Although the first Marvel superhero movie, Spider-Man, was planned to be released around 2000, from next year onwards, the layout of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe must be planned. Eric did not want to repeat the unlucky experience of Warner Brothers rushing to launch the DC Cinematic Universe, resulting in one movie after another either failing at the box office or having a bad reputation. The main design work of the Marvel Cinematic Universe plan was still handled by Marvel. However, if Eric wanted to participate in the creation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe plan, he also had to have a good understanding of the comic characters under Marvel. The thousands of comics in front of him were all moved from the Marvel archives in New York. When Eric used these comics, Stanley repeatedly told Eric to return them after reading them. Because of decades of accumulation, many of these comics had become very expensive collector's editions. Many Americans had a hobby of collecting comics. As a huge comic fan, Nicolas Cage even spent millions of dollars on his comic collection. Therefore, the pile of comics in front of him, many of which even looked a little old, was enough to make any veteran comic fan have the idea of robbing them. Noticing Eric's appearance, Nicole looked up and smiled at him. She took off the headphones hidden in her hair and said, "Eric, you're back." Eric nodded, took off his jacket, and walked over. Nicole put down her legs and moved to the side. The two squeezed into a single sofa and sat down. Putting on one of the headphones that Nicole had just taken off, Eric asked, "Where's Jason?" It was Thanksgiving soon, and the girl had been busy promoting Mission Impossible 2. Eric would be spending Thanksgiving with Nicole and Famick. After Thanksgiving, Mission Impossible 2 would be released. Eric would bring his little girl to New York to spend Christmas with the women and children. Recently, Nicole had been very fond of the pocketable MP3 player that Firefly Electronics had just developed. She put on the other earpiece and enjoyed the music coming out of the earpiece. She said, she went to the supermarket. "By the way, Eric, before you came back, Ms. Haynes sent some documents over. She said that they were sent from New York." Eric reached out and hugged Nicole's slender waist. He leaned against the back of the chair and said, "Leave it there first. I don't want to see any more company documents today." After hearing a series of bad news about Titanic in the afternoon, Eric was not in the mood to deal with any company affairs. Nicole was also aware of the huge pressure that Titanic had put on Firefly recently. She had already noticed the tiredness between Eric's eyebrows, so she did not mention it again. She picked up the thin comic on her lap and leaned in front of Eric. She said, "Eric, I found something very interesting. It turns out that Peter Parker's parents are CIA agents, and they even saved Wolverine." Eric knew that Nicole was deliberately starting a relaxed topic. He smiled and said, "If you read all the thousands of Marvel comics around you, you will find that almost all the characters in the Marvel comic system can be connected. Making popular characters have overlapping plots is a gimmick that many comic companies use to increase the sales of their works. It sounds very similar to MGM's Agent Cinematic Universe." Nicole tilted her head and said, "Or, did you get the inspiration for the Agent Cinematic Universe from the comic company?" Eric nodded and admitted, "Yes. Nicole did not expect her wild guess to be right. She was a little excited. She waved the comic in her hand and said, "Which superhero do you plan to shoot first?" "It has been confirmed that it will be Spider-Man. However, in addition, I will also cooperate with MGM and Fox. At the same time, I will start some other projects. In the future, I plan to bring all the popular characters in the entire Marvel Universe to the big screen. As the most popular superhero in Marvel, Spider-Man would definitely stay in Firefly." However, Eric had not yet thought about which superhero characters MGM and Fox would be responsible for. The distribution of Marvel superheroes in the original spacetime would definitely not be the same. This required a very detailed plan. Compared to DC, which had developed many successful live-action superhero movies, Marvel's popularity in movies was close to zero. Therefore, one thing Eric had confirmed was that he would first bring the successful superhero characters in the original spacetime to the big screen, such as Spider-Man, Iron Man, and X-Men. This could quickly open up the Marvel Cinematic Universe. After these characters had cultivated enough market and popularity, new superheroes would be introduced and the possibility of the movie's box office success would be higher. Nicole did not know the details of Eric's plan, but she could not help but sigh. Although these days were just for fun, Nicole had already gained some understanding of Marvel's comic characters. If the plan that Eric had just mentioned could be fully implemented, then this plan could definitely be described as grand. Then, if all of them are put on the big screen, there may be dozens of movies. Of course, Eric looked at Nicole's thin, moist lips that were slightly open because of surprise. He reached out and touched them gently and smiled. "You have also been reading comics for several days. Are there any characters you are interested in?" Nicole opened her small mouth and pretended to bite. Seeing him subconsciously retract his finger, she smiled and said, "I'm not interested for the time being. Speaking of which, Marvel doesn't seem to have a popular female superhero like DC's Wonder Woman. Popularity is slowly accumulated. If a female superhero under Marvel can have a successful TV series like Wonder Woman, she must be very popular now." Eric explained and stopped talking about this topic. Even if Nicole was interested in a female character, it was not so easy to join. Nicole's current salary has reached more than $15 million, the highest for an actress. This high salary is completely inconsistent with Eric's plan of Marvel's production of second- and third-tier Hollywood stars. However, Eric suddenly remembered something and quickly said, "Oh yeah, speaking of which, I have a role here that I hope you can support." Nicole showed a puzzled expression and keenly grasped a key word in Eric's tone. She said with a half-smile, "Support? Yeah, this is a trilogy series, and it may develop into 6 parts in the future. There is a character in it. She doesn't have many scenes, but she is very important. Out of all the actresses I know, I think you are the most suitable. However, in terms of salary, I can only give you $3 million because this is a group movie. Although your role is important, you are not the main character." Nicole blinked her light blue eyes and raised the corner of her mouth. She smiled and said, $3 million for a trilogy. I think if I agree, Pete might go crazy. However, since you said that I'm the only suitable candidate in your heart, then I'll agree to it. Hey, what kind of role is it? Based on Nicole's current net worth, taking on a trilogy for $3 million, as her agent, Pi Kingsley, would probably go crazy if she heard the news. This was not because her agent's commission would be greatly reduced, but because this performance contract would cause unpredictable risks to Nicole's position as an A-list actress. Eric reached out and held Nicole's chin, looking at the flawless face in front of him. Nicole was 29 years old this year, at the peak of a woman's youth. Slender eyelashes, round face, petite nose, thin lips, everything was so perfect. Eric couldn't help but kiss Nicole's lips and said, "Your role is an elf, Queen Galadriel, do you know? So it's Lord of the Rings." Nicole immediately understood. Eric nodded. In the original Lord of the Rings series, Queen Galadriel was played by Cate Blanchett. In terms of acting, Cate Blanchett was indeed better than Nicole, but in terms of beauty, Cate Blanchett was far inferior to Nicole. In Eric's view, as the embodiment of elegance and perfection, how could an elf not be beautiful? MGM will announce the Lord of the Rings series project next autumn. The trilogy will be back-to-back production, and it will take a little more than a year to shoot in New Zealand. However, your scenes should only take 2 to 3 weeks, so it won't take too much time. From this summer to next summer, MGM would release 3 heavyweight films from the MGM Secret Agent movie universe. As long as the 3 films performed well at the box office, MGM would have enough confidence to announce the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which involved $300 million. With the support of the Secret Agent movie universe project, the other shareholders of MGM wouldn't raise too strong of an objection. Nicole actually heard some news about the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but she didn't care about it. Instead, she stared at Eric and asked curiously, "If I'm Queen Galadriel, who's going to play Princess Arwen?" Eric didn't hide it and pinched Nicole's chin, saying, "Diane Kruger, what do you think?" "You really dote on those pretty babies," Nicole subconsciously teased. In the past 2 years, the Victoria's Secret Angels had appeared frequently in Hollywood films, and it had become a hot topic for many people. Everyone knew who was behind this. Therefore, there were countless rumors about Eric and the Victoria's Secret Angel Corps. The more exaggerated rumor even said that Eric had wiped out the Victoria's Secret Angel Corps. The woman beside him had teased him more than once about this matter, but Eric didn't mind. He said, "I just want this film to be more perfect. Since they're elves, they should be beautiful. Also, the earliest elves happen to be creatures from Germanic mythology. Diane is German, so she fits this setting 100%. I can't be bothered to listen to your explanation." Nicole rolled her eyes at him. She reached out to take the earpiece from Eric's ear and put it on her own. Just as she was about to say something, Famke Jensen walked through the hall in her high heels with 2 full convenience bags in her hands. Looking at Eric and Nicole snuggled together on the sofa, Famke Jensen said with some interest, "I went to buy food, but you two are here making out." "Haha, come, let's make out too." Eric looked at Famke Jensen put down the plastic bags and reached out to pull her to his side. Famke Jensen took the opportunity to sit on the other side of Eric's sofa. He pushed Eric's hand away and said, "All right, what were you two talking about?" Eric said casually, "We were talking about you. What are your plans after the new year?" The 7th season of The X-Files was already airing on Fox. This would also be the last episode of this classic sci-fi series. Although Fox had repeatedly offered very generous terms, Brad Pitt and Famke Jensen were unwilling to renew their contracts. Brad Pitt wanted to take the opportunity to enter the film industry, but Famke was a little tired of it. In order to save on the budget, the recent seasons of The X-Files had been filmed in Canada. Famke did not want to continue the days of running around outside for a few months every year. Sci-fi TV series were usually filmed in one go. Although the episodes were still airing, Famke had already finished all her work and was resting. "I don't have any plans for now. I plan to take a break for a year and do some charity work. After the new year, I plan to go to Africa with a charity team to visit refugees." Eric immediately looked worried and grabbed Famke's little hand. "Baby, please, don't adopt a black child like some Hollywood actresses. If you want, we can have one together. How about next year?" Famke's face was slightly red. She thought Eric was going to persuade her not to go to Africa and was a little touched. Hearing this, she slapped his strange hand away. "You unsympathetic bastard. I've decided to ignore you for the rest of the day. Nicole, can you help me bring these things into the kitchen? Of course, it's time to prepare dinner." Nicole gave Eric a look of schadenfreude. She got up and carried a plastic bag with Famke to the kitchen. Eric looked at the tall backs of the 2 women whispering as they walked away. He smiled and flipped through the comics beside him for a while. He found a comic and started reading it with great interest. A few eye-catching words were printed on the cover of the comic. Phoenix Awakens. Jean Grey, the strongest and most complex female superhero in the X-Men. The depth to be explored was definitely much richer than DC's Wonder Woman. Chapter 818. Thanksgiving Day in 1996 was on November 28, which was a little later than previous years. However, the Thanksgiving Day schedule started on November 15th. Rush Hour was not too conspicuous among the films that were released in November. After all, although Red District had a good response in North America at the beginning of the year, films with Asian protagonists were still a minority in Hollywood. Although the critical response after the test screening was good, the industry still only gave a box office estimate of $60 to $80 million. A large part of the reason for this was that one of the two protagonists was black. Black people were slightly less recognized in Hollywood than white people, but far more recognized than Asian people. On November 15th, Rush Hour opened in more than 2,600 theaters in North America. At the same time, Warner's live-action and animation film Space Slam Dunk was released. The lead actors were the famous Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny. The story was about a space monster that attempted to kidnap all of Warner's animated characters, including Bugs Bunny and Duck Toffee, to the space amusement park. In order to avoid being captured, the two parties finally decided to have a basketball game to determine the fate of all the animated characters. The space monster easily learned the skills of many NBA superstars. In desperation, Bugs Bunny asked NBA superstar Michael Jordan for help. The 1988 live-action and animation film, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, had a high box office of $150 million in North America with a cost of $45 million. Warner's Space Slam Dunk was obviously trying to replicate the box office success of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. The industry's expectations for the film were also very high. However, when Rush Hour and Space Slam Dunk were released at the same time, the box office results of the two films were very different from the industry's expectations. This surprised many people. Rush Hour had a box office of more than $42 million in its first week, surpassing its cost of $33 million in one fell swoop, and easily became the box office champion of the week. Even if it was based on the box office curve of Red District at the beginning of the year, the cumulative box office of the film would be close to $100 million. The audience's love for this film, which was full of humor from the dialogue to the action scenes, was far greater than Red District. After the film was released, the media quickly adjusted the total box office estimate for Rush Hour to between $120 million to $140 million. The box office of Space Slam Dunk was only 32 million yuan in the first week. Not only was it a full 10 million yuan lower than Rush Hour, but it was also far from the 50 million yuan that Warner had expected. However, the cost of this movie was more than twice that of Rush Hour, reaching $80 million. Based on the movie's current box office performance, the movie could recoup its cost through overseas distribution. However, Warner's ambitious plan to create a series of movies had been put on hold and there was no further progress. Then, on November 22nd, Mission Impossible 2 was officially released in 3,000 theaters in North America. This super agent movie was arguably the most anticipated film by the audience at the end of the year. Its production cost was second only to Titanic. A few days ago, Paramount chose to move Star Trek: First Contact from the Thanksgiving slot to the Christmas slot. Although they secretly had the intention of attacking Titanic, the reason they announced for avoiding Mission Impossible 2 was not just an excuse. Relying on the accumulated popularity of its predecessor and the strong influence of MGM's secret agent movie universe, Mission Impossible 2 lived up to expectations and earned $82.7 million in the first week. It easily broke the traditional box office record for the Thanksgiving slot in North America. It was second only to The Mummy 2 in the first week box office of 1996 in North America. These two movies were also the only two new movies released this year that grossed more than $80 million in the first week. Since MGM announced the Secret Agent Movie Universe project, the sequels to Thunderbolts and Mission Impossible had been very successful. Coupled with strong confidence in Casino Royale, which was personally produced by Eric, after the release of Mission Impossible 2, MGM's stock price soared again. The stock price exceeded $18.50, and the company's total market value easily exceeded $8 billion. Although the overall media industry had been on the rise in the past 2 years, MGM's market value was still at the bottom of the Big Seven. It was only slightly better than Sony Pictures. However, compared to its market value of just over $1 billion 2 years ago, MGM's growth rate was definitely the highest among the Big Seven. Eric spent Thanksgiving with Nicole and Famik in Los Angeles. In December, the two women flew back to Australia and the Netherlands respectively to spend Christmas with their families. Eric also temporarily stopped the post-production work of Casino Royale and flew to New York with Nicole to spend Christmas with Joanna and the others. In the manor in Southampton, snowflakes were falling outside, but the house was warm. It was already the 12th of December, and it was night time. Eric made a phone call and returned to the living room from the living room next door. The TV was on in the living room, but at this time, the whole family was crowded around the glass table in the middle of the living room. There were many beautifully printed New Year cards on the glass table. Joanna, who was kneeling on the thick carpet, turned her gaze away from her daughter, who was writing and drawing on the glass table, and looked at Eric with a questioning look in her eyes. Eric glanced at the TV. The nominees for the Golden Globe Awards would be announced at 8 o'clock on NBC. Noticing Joanna's expression, he explained, "It's Chris. He wants to meet me in Manhattan tomorrow to discuss something." Virginia also asked at this time, "Are you coming back tomorrow?" "Of course." Eric nodded and also sat down on the carpet. He held his son in his arms and held his little hand to fill in the New Year cards. These beautiful New Year cards were prepared for the senior management of Firefly, as well as family and friends. In the first few years, because Eric habitually felt that the relationships between Westerners were relatively weak, he never cared much about these things. Therefore, during the New Year, as the boss, he was more casual when giving New Year's gifts to the more important senior management of Firefly. It was not until the year before last, when Robert Iger, who was in charge of the TV business, called during the New Year, that Eric realized that the Westerners cared about the ways of the world as much as the Easterners did. The situation at that time was that on Christmas Eve, as usual, Eric prepared some New Year's gifts for all parties. Because of the acquisition of Metro ABC Group, Firefly's territory had been greatly expanded. Firefly had important departments on the east and west coasts, and even in many inland states, such as Disneyland in Florida, ESPN in Connecticut, and so on. Therefore, most of the gifts were sent by mail. During this process, a gift for Steve Stan, the chairman of ESPN in Connecticut, was accidentally lost by the postman. The year before, Firefly had just completed the acquisition of Metro ABC Group, and Steve Stan had received a New Year's gift from Eric. The next year, it was gone. When Steve Stan heard that his deputy had received a gift from Eric, he became even more nervous and did not have a good Christmas. He thought that Eric was dissatisfied with his work at ESPN and that he might lose his job. Until the new year, he still did not receive a gift. Steve Stan could not control the worry in his heart. He flew from Connecticut to New York and asked Robert Iger if Eric wanted to fire him. Since Steve Stan took charge of ESPN, ESPN's rapid growth was obvious to all. However, at that time, Firefly was making personnel changes in the TV business department that had been merged for more than a year. It was normal for some senior executives to be replaced by people from Firefly's headquarters. Robert Iger himself was leaning towards Steve Stan, so he called Eric on the pretext of holiday greetings to test Eric's attitude towards Steve Stan. Eric was also puzzled by Robert Iger and Steve Stan. Of course, he could not fire the manager who had brought EPSN step by step to the top. Robert Iger mentioned that he also affirmed and praised Steve Stan's work. Robert Iger heard that Eric did not want to fire Steve Stan, so he carefully probed about the New Year's gift. After some trouble, the ins and outs of the matter were sorted out. Eric did not expect that an accidentally lost New Year's gift would cause so much trouble for the senior executives. Therefore, he began to take this matter seriously. Since last year, Eric's New Year's gifts to the senior executives of Firefly were not only changed to a more professional courier company, but his assistant's office would also track and confirm each gift to ensure that the gift was delivered to the appropriate senior executive. In comparison, the cost of the courier was far more than the gift itself. This year's gift was a box of maple sugar biscuits made by the women and a New Year's greeting card. The senior executives who could receive a New Year's gift from Eric were at least the general managers of the group's branch companies. With the income of these people, it was impossible for them to value the gift itself. They were more concerned about the other meanings of Eric's New Year's gift. In order to show their sincerity, the New Year's greeting cards were handwritten by everyone. Kevin, Hawaii, and Emma, the three little guys, were just joining in the fun. Eric would not give away the little guys' greeting cards with crooked handwriting. The two little guys would be 4 years old next year. Since their third birthday at the beginning of the year, Virginia had stopped working. She had also specially hired a few education consultants to make a special early education plan for Kevin. Compared to Hawaii, who was unusually intelligent, the little guy's intellectual growth had always been Virginia's worry. Eric and Joanna actually knew that Kevin's development was actually not a problem at all. A little boy of 3 or 4 years old had no problems talking and walking. His body was also healthy. What more could they expect? The reason why Virginia had always been worried that Kevin's intellectual development was abnormal was because the little guy had an even more abnormal reference next to him. As soon as they arrived in New York, Joanna secretly told Eric that Hawaii had already finished 3 copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica this year. This was the result of Joanna deliberately controlling her daughter's reading time every day. What was more surprising was that Hawaii could even completely memorize large sections of the content. Eric knew that he definitely did not have this kind of memory ability. Even if it was the complete memory of his previous life, with the passage of time, he had begun to gradually forget it. Therefore, he would occasionally feel that his daughter was a little strange. Thinking in his heart, Eric couldn't help but raise his head to take a look. Hawaii was sitting opposite Joanna with a pencil in her hand. She had a bit of obvious indifference, but her beautiful blue eyes were curiously looking at the identical twins sitting diagonally opposite her. Hawaii still had a little fear of Drew, but she was very curious about the Russian twins who habitually followed Drew. It seemed that she wanted to know why there were 2 people who looked exactly the same. Sitting in the middle of the twins, Drew noticed Hawaii's curious little eyes. A naughty smile appeared on his baby face, and he suddenly made a face at the little girl. Eric clearly saw his precious daughter's little body tremble. He glared at Drew, and the little girl hurriedly admitted her mistake and stuck out her tongue at Eric. Joanna, of course, also noticed this little detail. She comforted Hawaii and looked at the little girl helplessly. "Drew, don't always scare Shasha." Okay, but Shasha is too timid. Look, Kevin isn't scared at all." Saying that, the little girl made the same face at Kevin in Eric's arms. Kevin looked at Virginia next to him clumsily, as if he was asking his mother, what was Aunt Drew doing? Well, the little guy's reaction seemed to be half a beat slower than others. Virginia knew that Drew was mocking her son's clumsiness, but she wasn't as polite as Joanna. She rolled up a magazine next to her and slapped it on the little girl's head. Drew knew that she was in the wrong, so she didn't dare to resist. She laughed and dodged a few times. Hearing the sound from the TV, she hurriedly said, "Stop, stop, stop. It's starting. The Golden Globe Award nominees are starting to be announced." Everyone knew that Eric was waiting for the Golden Globe Award nominees to be announced. Virginia put away the magazine in her hand, and Joanna hugged the restless Emma. Everyone looked at the TV screen together. The Golden Globe Award committee specially invited Tim Roth and Mira Sorvino, 2 Hollywood stars who had been nominated last year, and a host from NBC to announce the list of nominees. The first announcement was for the television category. With the rise of reality shows in recent years, the Golden Globe Awards also began to increase the number of Golden Globe Awards for reality shows this year. However, although they were both ranked second, the Golden Globe Awards were far less influential than the Emmy Awards in terms of television awards. The difference was much worse than the Golden Globe Awards and the Oscars. Because the Emmy Awards were usually announced at the end of August or the beginning of September, which happened to be the beginning of the New Year's fall season, the relevant awards played a very large role in early publicity for the new season of television shows. The major North American television stations also attached great importance to the Emmy Awards. A few of ABC and Lifetime TV's top dramas and reality shows had won the nominations. However, everyone was a little absent-minded. It wasn't until the television nominees were announced that everyone perked up. Although the Golden Globe Awards didn't have as many film awards as the Oscars, the first to be announced were still the secondary awards. Tim Roth first announced the nominees for Best Original Song. There were 5 nominees, but the name Titanic wasn't heard at all. Even without the box office miracle of Titanic, My Heart Will Go On definitely had the ability to win an Oscar. However, it wasn't even nominated for the Golden Globe Awards. Although Eric didn't care much about the Golden Globe Awards, he knew that the worries of the company's executives might come true. Eric didn't say anything, but Drew was indignant. Even the theme song of Batman Forever was nominated for Best Original Song, but My Heart Will Go On wasn't nominated. How ridiculous. Joanna also said gently, "Yes, My Heart Will Go On is very good." Eric shrugged and continued to look at the TV screen. He wanted to see how far the Golden Globe Awards committee could go. Chapter 8:19. After the Best Original Song nominees were announced, the next nominees were the Best Film Soundtrack nominees. Titanic had failed to win the Best Original Song nomination. Eric realized that if the Golden Globes really wanted to suppress this movie, they would probably only nominate it for Best Film Soundtrack. However, after Mira Sorvino announced the 5 nominees, Eric still didn't hear Titanic's name. Tapping his fingers on the glass table, Eric curled his lips and murmured, "There's no need to be so ruthless." Eric suddenly felt a little dispirited. He handed Kevin to Virginia and reached out for a blank New Year's card. He lowered his head and filled in the card. In the living room, the sound from the TV was still going on. The women all realized that Eric was a little irritated, so they carefully kept quiet and didn't disturb him. On the TV, NBC's host and 2 guests continued to announce the long list of nominees. From time to time, they would say a few witty words to liven up the atmosphere. The 2 nominations that should have been the easiest to get had unexpectedly fallen through. Eric felt that the Golden Globe Awards committee probably did not intend to give a single nomination to Titanic this time, so he did not have any expectations. He held a pencil and patiently drew cursive English on the New Year's card, trying to calm his recent irritation. After the Best Foreign Language Film nominees were announced, the host joked about the nominees. Mira Sorvino took out another list and read into the microphone, "Next, the nominees for the Golden Globes for Best Screenplay are Tom Stoppard and Mark Norman, Shakespeare in Love; Terrence Malick, Red Alert; Ethan Coen and Joel Coen, Frozen Blood; Jean Suddy, The Shining Style; and James Cameron, Titanic." Sensing Mira Sorvino's deliberate pause on the TV, Eric looked up. Hearing the name Titanic, the girl not far away immediately said excitedly, "Eric, we got a nomination." Eric nodded slightly, but there was confusion in his expression. He didn't quite understand the Golden Globe Awards' intentions. Could it be that the 2 nominations just now were just an accident, and the Golden Globe Awards jury wasn't affected? Could Titanic still have hope of being nominated for the Best Picture and other core awards? With some anticipation in his heart, Eric quietly listened to the entire nomination press conference, but his anticipation was quickly dashed. After that, he didn't hear a single word about Titanic. In the end, Titanic only received a slightly awkward nomination for Best Screenplay, and nothing else. Under normal circumstances, the Oscars and the Golden Globe Awards, which at least tried to maintain their credibility on the surface, were relatively fair in the nomination stage. If it was in the past, the quality of Titanic was there. Even if the Golden Globe Awards wanted to deliberately suppress it under the influence of some people, they would have to consider the risk of losing credibility. However, after watching the nomination press conference, Eric roughly understood that the situation this year was very different from before. According to the usual saying, this year was definitely going to be an Oscar year, and it could be considered a super big year. It could be seen from the list of nominees for the Golden Globe Awards that Shakespeare's Love, Red Alert, Frozen Blood, and The Shining Light had an average of more than 5 nominations. Their performances were exceptionally strong. Other films such as Mr. Sugar, Sex Bookmaster, and Mrs. Varen were also quite outstanding. Under such circumstances, the Golden Globes could be said to be fearless. With so many excellent films in front, even if Titanic was nominated, the Golden Globes judges didn't think that such a purely commercial blockbuster could win an award under the watchful eyes of so many heroes. Since Titanic had no hope of winning an award, there was no risk of losing credibility if they didn't nominate it now. Eric even realized that there was something fishy about the Best Screenplay nomination. If Titanic was nominated for Best Original Song and Best Film Soundtrack, the strength of the film soundtrack could still compete with other films. These two nominations had failed, and they had only given a nomination for Best Screenplay, which was not in the slightest advantage. It was obvious that someone wanted Titanic to return empty-handed and not give the movie any hope of breaking through. Eric. Noticing that Eric seemed to have been silent for a long time, Virginia, who was next to him, called out softly, "I'm fine." Eric came back to his senses and looked at the woman's concerned eyes. He smiled, paused for a moment, and suddenly whispered to himself, "I'm just reflecting. Are there too many film companies in Hollywood?" Virginia didn't notice the determination in Eric's eyes. She asked, "How many do you think are appropriate? Big 4 or Big 3? Eric shrugged slightly. If there are fewer, or if they're all family, they won't always think about breaking other people's bowls so that they can eat more. Virginia also felt some strong emotions in Eric's tone at this time. She smiled and said, "How is that possible?" Just as he was about to say something, the phone on the glass table vibrated. Eric looked at the number. It was from Katzenberg in Los Angeles. Eric picked up the phone and gestured to the women. He got up and said, "I'm going to take a call." While Eric and Katzenberg were discussing the possible impact of the Golden Globe Award nomination on the phone, in a mansion in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, Michael Eisner, who had just finished watching the live broadcast on TV, was in a very happy mood. Hollywood was also a business. The business world was like a battlefield. Although the competition between several major film companies did not lead to a life-and-death confrontation, the parties were also natural enemies. No one would be soft-hearted if they could give their competitors a push when they were on the edge of the cliff. This time, Michael Eisner was also involved in the operation of Titanic to be nominated for the Golden Globe Award. However, he would not make the same mistake as a few years ago. He no longer believed in a loose temporary alliance. Instead, he hid behind the scenes and secretly pushed for it. If others were involved, everyone had a tacit understanding. If no one was involved, Michael Eisner didn't care. However, there were a lot of people who took the initiative to move behind the scenes this time. Although on the surface, his relationship with Eric had eased in recent years, he would never forget the past when he was expelled from Disney. As Firefly grew step by step in recent years, Michael Eisner felt that if he had not been forced to leave Disney, all the status and glory of Firefly in the Hollywood industry might have been his. After all, in the past 2 years, Universal's development in the film business could be said to be second only to Firefly. This summer, Universal's total box office even surpassed Firefly's. He felt that this was enough to prove their strength. However, Michael Eisner also realized that the development of Universal Pictures had entered a bottleneck stage. In recent years, with the rapid expansion of the global film market, Hollywood gradually realized the strong advantages and rich profits of large-scale special effects movies in global distribution. However, in the whole of Hollywood, except for Firefly, which had enough strength to produce more than 3 special effects blockbusters every year, the other 6 major studios, without the support of Firefly's digital domain special effects technology, would not be able to complete these unless the requirements for the special effects quality of the film were greatly reduced. Whether it was Warner, Universal, or Paramount, with all their resources, they could probably only produce 1 or 2 blockbuster movies with special effects every year. The restrictions had little to do with funding, but mainly with CG special effects technology. Digital Domain had developed to this day. In addition to the headquarters in Los Angeles, they had also set up 2 subsidiaries in Florida and Australia, with a total staff of more than 2,300 people. Moreover, talent was secondary. As long as they were willing to spend a lot of money, they could also poach the best special effects artists. However, compared to other special effects studios in Hollywood, Digital Domain's biggest advantage was its technical accumulation in CG special effects. Eric Williams was a few years ahead of others in the industry and invested heavily in the research and development of computer CG special effects technology. At this time, Digital Domain's special effects software, rendering technology, and even large-scale rendering farms and hardware were 2 to 3 years ahead of others in the industry. The gap between them could no longer be closed by poaching and large investments. Even though Universal was very reluctant to cooperate with Firefly when they produced The Mummy 2, they had to hand over a large number of difficult special effects shots to Digital Domain. The other major film companies also relied more or less on Digital Domain. It was this dependence that provided more opportunities for Digital Domain to develop and accumulate technology, pushing them further ahead of their peers in the industry. At this time, the other major film companies had actually discovered a cruel fact. If Firefly cut off their cooperation with Digital Domain, then there was no doubt that in the next few years, it would be difficult for them to produce a film that could compete with Firefly in terms of special effects. For Firefly Group, which had an annual turnover of more than $20 billion, even if Titanic was a complete loss, it would not have any substantial impact on the company's economy. However, many things could not be measured by simple money. The total investment in the production and distribution of Titanic was $265 million, which was unprecedented in the history of Hollywood film. If such a large-scale film project failed, the blow to Firefly Group's confidence in film production would be immeasurable. This was the result that Michael Eisner was looking forward to. Although Eric had absolute control over Firefly, he could not completely ignore the wishes of the management and the other shareholders. That would only cause Firefly Group to fall into turmoil. When a mega project like Titanic failed, Firefly shareholders and executives would inevitably reflect on their film production and distribution strategy in recent years. The result of this reflection was bound to be that Firefly would tend to be conservative in film production for a long time in the future. With Firefly's 2,300 employees in Digital Domain, it was enough to support the production of 4 to 6 special effects films at the same time. Once Firefly's film production scale tended to be conservative due to the box office failure of Titanic, Digital Domain would have to rely on external orders to ensure that more than 2,000 employees would not have nothing to do. Then, at least in the next few years, the possibility of Firefly cutting off cooperation with Digital Domain did not exist. The slowdown in the development of Firefly's film business also gave the other film companies enough time to catch up with Firefly's footsteps in terms of film production and special effects technology accumulation. When Firefly Group recovered from the failure of Titanic, perhaps the starting line would not be so far apart. After secretly giving Firefly a push at the Golden Globe Awards, Michael Eisner did not intend to continue doing anything superfluous. Now that almost the entire industry was pessimistic about Titanic, even Firefly Group did not have much hope for this film. The failure of Titanic was almost inevitable. At this time, he had already begun to consider the development plan for Universal next year. The production of The Mummy 3 was a bit difficult. The consecutive success of the first 2 films had led to a large increase in the salary of the film's producers and the movie's lead actors. Immediately starting production, whether it was changing the cast to reduce the budget or increasing the budget to invite the original cast, Universal would have to take a very big risk. Therefore, Michael Eisner decided to start the Scorpion King film derived from the Mummy series. This was an idea that came to him a long time ago when he saw this project. Sorting out the various thoughts in his mind, unknowingly, it was already close to 10 o'clock. Michael Eisner's wife, Jane Breckenridge, began to urge her husband to rest. After Michael Eisner's daunting quadruple bypass surgery 2 years ago, although he recovered well, it was taboo for people with a weak heart to stay up late. In this regard, Jane kept a very close eye on her husband. Hearing his wife's urging, Michael Eisner got up from the sofa in the living room and walked towards the bedroom. In his mind, he was planning to have dinner with George Lucas tomorrow to talk about the cooperation between Universal Pictures and Industrial Light and Magic. Although he had strong support from Microsoft, Michael Eisner was not optimistic about the NBin Pictures that Spielberg and the others were collaborating with. Therefore, Universal was not very active in fighting for the distribution rights of NBin Pictures. However, Michael Eisner valued the development prospects of Industrial Light and Magic very much. Although this special effects company was a little far behind the digital field, as a veteran special effects giant, Industrial Light and Magic was the last company in the industry that could catch up with the digital field. Michael Eisner was very clear that only when Industrial Light and Magic developed and was on par with the digital field could everyone avoid being suddenly choked by Firefly. Chapter 8:20. The day after the Golden Globe nominations were announced happened to be Friday. With the large-scale release of Sony's Mr. Sugar and Paramount's Star Trek: First Contact, it announced the arrival of the hottest Christmas slot at the end of the year. MGM's Mission Impossible 2 had a strong year-end performance. After the first week's box office of more than $82 million, the 3-week cumulative box office had reached $165 million. The total box office of the 19 countries that had been released overseas also exceeded $100 million. It was in the limelight for a while. Kevin Costner, who suffered a big setback with Future Waterworld, returned to the ranks of Hollywood's A-list superstars with the strong performance of Mission Impossible 2. Although MGM had negotiated 2 sequels at once during the downturn after the failure of Kevin Costner's Future Waterworld, the launch of Mission Impossible 3 would not cause too much of a stir. However, because Mission Impossible had the most eye-catching box office performance of the 3 series in the Agent movie universe, it was conceivable that in the future, Mission Impossible 4, and even the deeper intersections of the Agent movie universe, MGM would inevitably have a tug-of-war negotiation with Kevin Costner again. Of course, strictly speaking, this should be a happy annoyance. Any studio in Hollywood was eagerly looking forward to similar annoyances. Firefly's New Line Cinema's Rush Hour, during the Thanksgiving period, had a box office of $38 million in the 4th week and a total of $166 million. It became the second film under New Line this year to surpass $100 million. Based on the current box office trend, the total box office of Rush Hour in North America could reach at least $140 million. In the eyes of the outside world, compared to the relatively low box office performance of Firefly this year, New Line's low-budget films under $30 million performed extremely well. New Line produced and released a total of 16 films this year. If not including Jedi Cop 2, that Eric had moved to next year's summer, the average production cost of the remaining 15 films was only $16 million. Based on released films, New Line only invested $240 million in film production this year, which was not much different from the production cost of Titanic. However, in terms of returns, the North American box office of New Line's 4 best-performing movies this year, Rush Hour, 7 Deadly Sins, Final Destination, and Red Zone, were estimated to reach a total of $350 million. As for the other 11 movies, although there were some failures that only grossed $2 to $3 million, the total box office of the 10 movies was more than $120 million. Under normal circumstances, low and medium-budget films often had strong local cultural characteristics, making it difficult for them to make a difference in the overseas market. However, with the overseas box office of $220 million for 7 Deadly Sins, which was more than twice the local box office, New Line's overseas box office also reached $560 million. In 1996, New Line Cinema, with a production budget of $240 million, achieved a total box office of $1.03 billion worldwide. Excluding the income from videotapes and television broadcast rights, just the box office alone brought Firefly Group more than $200 million in profit. Titanic only received an insignificant nomination for Best Screenplay at the Golden Globe Award nomination conference. Although there were many voices of doubt, the general trend of the media was that Titanic was even more negative because of the Golden Globe Award nomination failure. The news of Rush Hour, breaking the $100 million box office in North America, happened to appear in the media on the same day as the Golden Globe Award nomination. As the producer and distributor of Rush Hour, New Line Cinema's annual production budget, which was very comparable to Titanic, also appeared in the media's vision. With the same production budget of about $200 million, New Line Cinema's 15 low and medium-budget films in 1996 generated more than $1 billion worldwide box office, while the future of Titanic was uncertain at this time. In the eyes of most people, it was almost inevitable that the movie would face a huge loss. This strong contrast undoubtedly poured cold water on the big investment and production trend that had arisen in Hollywood in recent years. Soon, there were many reflective comments in the media. The latest issue of The Hollywood Reporter had a prominent position on the front page and devoted a large amount of space to this. Since the early 1990s, Hollywood seems to have become more and more obsessed with blockbuster films. It is undeniable that movies such as Jurassic Park, The Mummy, and Men in Black have brought unusually high profits to the relevant production companies, but we absolutely can't ignore the disastrous consequences caused to investors and production companies by the failure of big-budget films such as Throat Cut Island, Future Waterworld, The Wind of the Mountain, and Phantom Hero. The tragic failure of Cutthroat Island directly led to Firefly Pictures, which was still very weak at the time, to merge with the Disney Group like a snake swallowing an elephant. And this year, the Firefly Group, which has always been successful in making big movies, seems to be going through an epic disaster, like the one in 1912 together with the unprecedented investment of $215 million in Titanic. On the other hand, film companies such as New Line Cinema, Mike, and others, which mainly focus on low and medium-budget productions, have quietly developed and expanded with cautious and stable production strategies, eating away at the film market share. Especially New Line, a subsidiary of the Firefly Group, has leveraged more than $1 billion worldwide box office with an annual production budget comparable to that of Titanic. As of the first week of December, New Line's share of the box office of North America's cumulative total of $5.9 billion in 1996 reached 7.8%. This proportion is almost comparable to that of the two veteran film companies, Sony Pictures and Paramount Pictures. As a creative industry, of course, Hollywood must achieve innovation and exploration in film production techniques, special effects technology, and other aspects through some high-budget investment projects to achieve the purpose of providing better film and television content to the audience. But at the same time, we have to reflect. Perhaps Hollywood needs to return to the tent-pole theory strategy once proposed by Mr. Barry Diller. Using a small number of blockbuster films as tent poles to prop up a large number of low and medium-budget films as curtains is the most orthodox way for Hollywood film companies to survive. On the contrary, if a film company only wants to rely on a few tent poles to survive and ignores the existence of the curtains, you can imagine how miserable the scene will be when the storm strikes. After the Hollywood Reporter article was published, a large number of media outlets began to echo it. Eric was in New York, but he also saw the article first. Although he had recently thought about the trajectory of Firefly's development in recent years, Eric still scoffed at the views expressed in the article. The prevalence of big-budget films was almost an inevitable trend in Hollywood's development, because this type of film not only had a natural strong influence, but also movies such as Jurassic Park could not only bring in huge profits from box office, videotapes, and television broadcast rights, but they could also form a profitable peripheral industry chain involving peripheral toys, computer games, franchise licensing, and so on. This potential commercial return was incomparable to low and medium-budget films. Most low and medium-budget films, even if they were successful in the box office, often stopped at videotapes and television broadcast rights. 4 medium-budget films like Jedi Cop and Rush Hour, which had the potential for sequels, after the success of the first film, the production budget of the sequels would undoubtedly double and inevitably enter the ranks of big-budget films. No matter what the outside media said, no matter how anxious the management of Firefly was, and no matter how the other Hollywood film companies were gloating, the release date of Titanic was still approaching day by day. In the last week, Titanic launched an even more intensive trailer bombardment on Firefly's television network. Giant posters of Titanic also began to be erected in prominent landmark locations in major North American cities. Cameron, Xiao Li, Rachel Weisz, and other film creators appeared on mainstream talk shows in North America. Although Eric did not directly participate in the final stage of Titanic promotion, he spent almost 2 to 3 hours a day in Southampton communicating with Firefly's management, distribution department, and creative team in various aspects. On December 19th, the box office data for the first week of the Christmas season was roughly calculated. The 2 new films released this week, Star Trek, First Contact, and Mr. Sweetheart, earned $43 million and $24 million respectively. According to the box office trend of the 2 films, it would not have much impact on the upcoming release of Titanic. The comedy, The Martian, which was about to be released at the same time as Titanic, was also not a big threat. After all, although it was starring veteran Hollywood superstar Jack Nicholson, it could not be compared to Titanic in terms of production budget, pre-release reputation, or scale of publicity. Although the other Hollywood film companies had the intention to snipe Titanic, they were still a little afraid and would not directly compete with Titanic with a heavyweight film. The biggest enemy of Titanic was actually only whether the film could be strongly welcomed by the market and create the original box office miracle like in the original spacetime. The final scale of Titanic was 2,770 cinemas. Although Firefly hoped to have more than 3,000 cinemas, because Titanic was more than 3 hours long and the industry was overwhelmingly pessimistic about this movie, many cinemas that did not have a close relationship with Firefly refused to screen Titanic for Titanic. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Eric and Katzenberg finished discussing the publicity strategy for the first week of Titanic over the phone. After hanging up the phone, he did not think too much about the film. Everything was done, and the rest was up to fate. Eric casually threw his phone on the coffee table in the living room and reached out to pick up his daughter, who was leaning against Joanna and watching TV with her beautiful blue eyes without blinking. He said, "Shasha, it's not good to watch too much TV. Daddy will read you a bedtime story, okay?" Hawaii struggled a little in Eric's arms, but her eyes were still fixed on the TV screen. She said in a dissatisfied tone, "But Daddy, I'm not sleepy. Kevin has already gone to bed. You have to rest early too. You'll be sleepy after listening to a bedtime story for a while," Eric said. Emma, who was sitting next to Drew, also got up and ran over, saying that she wanted to listen to a bedtime story together. She even blinked her big eyes and reached out to Eric to hug her. Emma was going to be 5 years old soon, but the little girl seemed to have a tendency to be small again. Although she was 2 years older than Hawaii and Kevin, she was only a little taller than Hawaii at this time. Eric carried Emma easily and walked to the little girl's bedroom, one in each hand. He asked, "So, what do you want to listen to?" The TV disappeared from sight. Seeing that there was no turning back, Hawaii reluctantly turned to Eric and said, "Daddy, bedtime stories are so boring. Can I read the encyclopedia?" Eric said helplessly, "Baby, if you do that, Daddy will probably fall asleep first." Hearing the conversation between the father and daughter, Joanna and the others on the sofa could not help but chuckle. They knew that Eric had been under a lot of pressure recently. In addition to the gloomy box office prospects of Titanic, Clover Holdings, a subsidiary of Firefly, had suddenly invested $1.5 billion in hot technology stocks on the Nasdaq market in 3 months at the end of the year. Recently, with the company's financial statistics at the end of the year, the news was announced that Eric had a dispute with Way West, a member of the board of directors and one of the shareholders of Firefly Group, in Manhattan a few days ago. Buffett also expressed his doubts and dissatisfaction over the phone. At this time, listening to the relaxed conversation between Eric and his daughter, Joanna and the others knew that Eric's mentality was not too affected by the recent series of events, and they were slightly relieved. The next day, he woke up very early. He looked at the watch on the bedside table. It was just past 7 o'clock, and the sky outside the window was not yet bright. Eric was no longer sleepy. He carefully left the little girl in his arms, quietly put on his clothes, and walked out of the bedroom. The snow from last week had not completely melted yet, and the sky had already turned gray again today. The maids in the manor had already begun to prepare breakfast. Today's newspapers were already on the coffee table in the living room. Eric sat down on the sofa and read them one by one. These days, the topic of Titanic had experienced too much saliva, and the media seemed to be a little tired of it. Although there was a large-scale production last night, because it was in the middle of winter, and because Titanic was a long 3 hours long, many people inevitably gave up watching the midnight screening. There were not many reviews about Titanic in the newspapers today. The overall review was almost the same as the pre-screening stage. The detailed analysis of the media trend would have to wait for the report from the marketing department of Firefly. At this time, Eric could not see the general trend just by reading a few newspapers. Close to 8 o'clock, Joanna and Natasha woke up one after another. Eric had just put down the newspaper and walked into the gym when the phone he carried with him rang. The call was from Katzenberg in Los Angeles. It was only 5 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles, but it was not a problem for Katzenberg. There were 2 workaholics in the senior management of Firefly Group. One of them was Katzenberg, and the other was, of course, not Eric, but Robert Iger. Compared to Katzenberg's 5 hours of sleep a day, Robert Iger seemed to be more ruthless. He woke up at 4:30 every day. The two talked on the phone for more than 10 minutes. Eric temporarily put down his morning exercise and went to the study. There was a huge white writing board hanging on the entire wall of the study. At this time, the words Titanic were written at the top of the board, and below it was a list of tables. Picking up the black pen next to him, Eric calmly wrote the midnight box office of Titanic in the first grid. $1. 56 million. Calm and collected, neither hot nor cold. Chapter 8:21. As a very common entertainment activity in life, Americans were also very mature when it came to watching movies. They would only choose to watch movies based on their personal preferences and the movie's reputation. The key factor for the success or failure of a movie's box office was always the quality of the movie, and it had little to do with the size of the production budget. This was also the reason why movies such as Cleopatra and Heaven's Gate from many years ago to Throat Cutter Island and Future Waterworld in recent years still suffered box office failures despite spending a jaw-dropping production budget. Before Titanic was released, although there was no lack of positive reviews, the media was almost one-sided in their criticism of the movie's box office prospects. This subtly created a potential impression in the public's mind that this was another expensive movie that was not worth watching like Future Waterworld. The midnight opening of $1.56 million was only one-third of last month's Mission Impossible 2. It was not even as good as Paramount's Star Trek: First Contact a week ago. There was no doubt that the lukewarm pre-release reviews and the long duration of the movie prevented most interested audiences from braving the cold winter to stay in the midnight cinema for 3 hours. However, the next day, although there was no dramatic reversal in the reviews of Titanic in the media, audiences who were interested in the movie gradually began to enter the cinema. Manhattan, New York. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Simon Pegg stood in line at the ticket hall of the Paris Cinema on 58th Street near Central Park. He listened to the crowd around him whispering about the new movie that had recently been released. Simon Pegg was not a movie fan. He didn't even like watching movies, or rather, he didn't have the time. As a professional elite who had just jumped to Lehman Brothers as a financial analyst, he, who was born in a poor family in the United States, devoted almost all his energy to his studies and work in order to get rid of his poor life. Even at this time, because of his experience at Columbia Business School, he was still carrying more than $30,000 in student loans from the bank. However, after he jumped ship from his first private investment company and got a job at Lehman Brothers with an annual salary of $68,000, the pressure on him finally lessened. A few months ago, a friend introduced him to a good girlfriend named Charlotte Davis. He was dragged here today by his girlfriend who liked to watch movies. When it was his turn, Simon Pegg handed over his change and asked for a ticket for Titanic. He turned and walked toward his girlfriend, who was waving at him. Simon Pegg waved the movie ticket in his hand at Charlotte, who was holding 2 buckets of popcorn, and said in a persuasive tone, "Hey, baby, I just heard people talking about this movie. It doesn't seem to be that good, and it's too long. It's 3 hours long." Charlotte Davis didn't like disaster movies either, but this was a movie that Eric Williams supported. That chance encounter was the deepest secret in the hearts of Charlotte and her best friend, Alice. The two of them didn't easily tell anyone about it. However, because of their encounter back then, the two of them would always subconsciously pay attention to Eric's various movements in Hollywood. They would also subconsciously support the films that Eric valued. Moreover, until now, she had never been disappointed. So, being disappointed once in a while would be a different experience. It was the Christmas holiday, and Alice had returned to Colorado to spend Christmas with her parents. Thus, Charlotte could only watch this movie with her new boyfriend. At this moment, hearing Simon Pegg's words, Charlotte gently rolled her eyes. She smiled and asked, "Then, what movie do you think we should watch?" Simon Pegg subconsciously opened his mouth, but didn't say the name of any movie for a moment. Charlotte knew that her new boyfriend was practically an idiot when it came to movies. She chuckled and ignored his embarrassed look. She stuffed a bucket of popcorn into his arms and said, "Okay, let's go in. It's about to start." Although it was prime time, and it was the first day of Titanic, the theater was still a little empty. Less than half of the 100 people in the theater were seated. Charlotte and her idiot boyfriend chose their seats and sat down. The audience around them were whispering softly. They could even hear a middle school couple in the front row complaining to her boyfriend that he shouldn't have chosen this movie. The boy seemed to be a die-hard fan of the Terminator series. When he talked to the girl, he said that he was only supporting his idol. Charlotte could imagine that most of the audience in the theater chose this movie because they wanted to support a famous director like Cameron, or because of the $215 million investment, or purely because of Firefly's overwhelming publicity. Perhaps, less than a third of the audience was actually interested in the movie. Most cinemas would have about 15 minutes of previews before showing the main movie. However, perhaps due to the long duration of Titanic itself, the trailer this time was only 5 minutes long. Very quickly, the animated logo of a girl from Firefly Pictures releasing fireflies appeared on the screen. The movie began with the treasure hunter Brock Lovett's exploration of the Titanic. Most of the audience immediately realized that the movie was using flashbacks. Westerners generally had a strong love for treasure hunting. Therefore, this scene didn't arouse too much disgust. Most of the audience in the theater enjoyed it. Almost no one thought that the plot was redundant. The white-haired old Rose appeared on the treasure hunting ship, reminiscing about the dusty past. When the gigantic body of the Titanic appeared at the port of Southampton in England, everyone let out faint gasps of surprise. Simon Pegg, who didn't expect anything and just wanted to spend time with his girlfriend, couldn't help but straighten his back. He said in surprise, "Is this real? This is so shocking. I wonder how he did it." Charlotte was very satisfied with Simon Pegg's reaction. She explained with a smile, "It is said that James Cameron recreated the model of the Titanic on the film set at a scale of 1:1. Looking at the bustling Southampton port that was perfectly restored by James Cameron on the screen, Simon Pegg could not help but shake his head and sigh. No wonder they spent $215 million. This amount of money is enough to build a real giant cruise ship. In the next hour, Jack and Rose met, got to know each other, and fell in love with each other. The movie showed all aspects of the Titanic from the perspective of the two main characters. The extravagance, arrogance, ignorance, and hypocrisy of the nobles in the first-class cabin, and the simplicity, cheerfulness, humor, and optimism of the common people in the bottom-class cabin. Although there were some obvious biases, it still catered to the majority of the audience's disdain for the rich and powerful. As a veteran movie fan, Charlotte could feel that the emotional scenes between Jack and Rose were a little shaky. Many of the dialogues in the first half of the movie seemed to be completely unnecessary. However, with the beautiful scene of Jack and Rose flying at the bow of the ship, and the crew member on the watchtower shouting, "Iceberg, right ahead!" At night, most of the audience's impatience disappeared once again. They silently waited for the arrival of the disaster. Perhaps no one had realized that, through the film's meticulous depiction of the passengers from all walks of life on the Titanic, their emotions had been unknowingly controlled by the big ship. Even though they knew that the sinking was inevitable and a disaster was bound to happen, some of the audience still subconsciously hoped that some impossible miracles would happen. In the end, the miracle didn't happen. After the collision with the iceberg, the Titanic began to fill with water and entered the countdown to sinking. The passengers in the first-class cabin began to evacuate, and the common people in the lower-class cabin were abandoned. The kindness and tolerance of human nature, the ugliness and despicableness, were clearly displayed in front of everyone at the moment of the disaster. If the sinking of the ship only touched everyone's hearts, the last 20 minutes of the movie were completely tear-jerking. Listening to Jack encouraging Rose to live on bravely until she closed her eyes and could no longer speak, and finally quietly sank into the abyss, everyone in the theater felt a heart-wrenching pain in their hearts. Even after Rose was rescued, this heart-wrenching feeling did not dissipate at all. Charlotte clearly heard the faint sobbing sound in the theater. She also felt tears flowing from the corner of her eyes. She wiped them a few times, but no matter how hard she tried, they would not dry. Her body subconsciously leaned against her boyfriend beside her. Simon Pegg did not say anything. With red eyes, he reached out an arm and quietly hugged his girlfriend. Until the old Rose returned to the past in her dream, and the ending music played, everyone's emotions did not calm down. After 3 hours, if it were any other movie, perhaps most of the audience's first reaction would be to hurriedly get up and leave the theater when the ending credits rose. However, this time, no one got up. Everyone sat quietly in their seats, letting Celine Dion's heavenly voice reverberate in the theater. When they left the theater, it was already 11 o'clock. The theater was still brightly lit. Charlotte leaned against Simon Peck softly. The two walked out of the theater with their arms around each other. Inadvertently, they looked around and found that there were many couples hugging each other with red eyes. For some reason, this scene touched Charlotte's nerves. She could not help but smile. Then, she began to worry again. Originally, she did not have high expectations for Titanic. She just wanted to support the movie that Eric thought highly of. However, she now realized that the media that criticized Titanic before was just talking nonsense. Although there were some flaws, there was no doubt that this was a very good movie. It definitely did not deserve the cold treatment it had received. Absolutely not. After making up her mind, Simon Peck drove her back to her apartment in the city center. Although her boyfriend looked at her expectantly, Charlotte still rejected his offer to stay the night. After sending her boyfriend away gently, Charlotte returned to her apartment. She picked up the cordless phone and called her best friend, Alice, who was in her hometown in Colorado. At the same time, she turned on the computer in the living room. "Hey, Alice, did you go to watch Titanic?" The call went through, and Charlotte went straight to the point while operating the computer mouse. The other party said a few words, and Charlotte eagerly said, "No, you must watch this movie. It's definitely a great movie. Do you still remember the New York Times review of Titanic? I can tell you with certainty now that this is indeed a masterpiece comparable to Gone with the Wind." The two chatted for a while and hung up. Charlotte turned her gaze to the computer screen. She had already opened the Yahoo Forums discussion section for Titanic. At this time, the discussion section was also very lively. Unlike the media, who had not even watched the movie, most of the people in the discussion section of Yahoo's Titanic were the audience who had watched the movie. The reactions of this group of people were more realistic and intuitive. "Oh my God, I can't believe I'm crying over such a melodramatic movie. Oh my God, this can't be real. Rose is so beautiful. Why haven't I heard of this actress named Rachel Weisz before? Do you know which movies she has acted in? The ending song is so beautiful. Did you notice that it was written by Eric Williams himself? I've already bought the tickets for tomorrow night. I want to watch it again. The scene of Jack and Rose standing at the bow of the ship is so dreamy. I really want to collect a poster like this. I wonder if Firefly will have a poster like this in the future. Maybe I can sneak a camera in next time and take a picture. Take 2 pictures and give me 1. Take 3 pictures and give me 1. Take 4 pictures and give me 1. Charlotte browsed through the posts on the page. She also had a deep impression of the beautiful scene of Jack and Rose flying at the bow of the ship. She noticed the topic above and clicked in. Looking at the neatly organized replies below, she could not help but smile. Looking at the number of replies, she jokingly typed a few words on the keyboard: "Take 109 pictures and give me 1. Exiting the topic and returning to the main page, Charlotte skimmed through the posts on the first few pages. Most of the people were praising Titanic, and some of the posts that were criticizing the film had caused a one-sided crusade by the fans. After organizing her thoughts, Charlotte opened the post page and began to consider her own feelings about the movie. Although she did not have the talent to write movie reviews, at this time, she still wanted more people to know how outstanding this movie was and that no one should miss it. Before watching this movie, I also had doubts about the 3-hour length of the movie. I don't understand why Firefly allowed James Cameron to make a commercial blockbuster like this. However, at this moment, I suddenly understood a lot of things. Every minute of this movie is indispensable. Although the shipwreck scene only takes up 1/3 of the entire movie, James Cameron has created a perfect "you were there" atmosphere for us. Through more than an hour of panoramic views of the various characters and scenery on the Titanic after it set sail, we are once again brought back to the epic ship of that year, and we are unwittingly immersed in it. Therefore, when the disaster comes, we will also have a more detailed and profound experience of all the characters in the movie, as well as their joy, anger, sorrow, and joy. This is also why many people are deeply moved after watching the movie. The disaster scene in the second half of the movie is even more impressive. Jack's simple and sincere farewell is tear-jerking, and Rose's eyes looking at the sky are even more heartbreaking. The handsome Leonardo DiCaprio and the beautiful Rachel Weisz gave us a very wonderful performance. They are both very outstanding actors, especially Rachel Weisz's natural aristocratic temperament. One can't help but wonder if she was born in a British aristocratic family. Finally, the song My Heart Will Go On, Celine Dion's heavenly voice is intoxicating. I even feel that Eric Williams spared no effort to support James Cameron's extravagant spending just for this song to create a perfect and sad dream. I can't give any more praise for this movie. I just sincerely hope that everyone can abandon the media's previous bias towards this movie and walk into the cinema. Believe me, you will not be disappointed. After checking, Charlotte clicked on the post and refreshed it several times. Soon, a series of echoing replies appeared under the topic. At this time, in the entire United States, Charlotte was not the only one who was deeply fascinated by Titanic and couldn't wait to recommend it to others. There were countless fans like Charlotte who spontaneously promoted Titanic and recommended it to others around them. With the large-scale release of Titanic, a large number of North American media no longer focused on the topic of the high budget of the movie, but shifted their attention to the quality of the movie itself. While the movie was being spread by word of mouth among fans who had watched it, the movie's reputation began to improve. First of all, I have to admit that I watched this movie with a strong bias. I always felt that Hollywood's investment in big-budget movies had gone crazy. Although I still hold this view after watching this movie, I have to say that James Cameron is really king genius. Titanic almost perfectly restored everything on this giant ship in terms of details and brought us a deep and tragic love story. The so-called tragedy is to break the perfect thing for people to see. James Cameron did this vividly in 3 hours, but at the same time, he didn't take away all our hope. In the movie, the details of the old Rose's life, those photos, that tank of goldfish, all show us her deep love for life. Long Island, in the Southampton Manor. Eric ignored the various changes in the public's attitude towards Titanic, and peacefully spent the upcoming Christmas with his wife and children. However, on the white writing board in the study, there would be an additional number every day. Number 19. $1. 56 million, midnight. Number 20. $8. 65 million. Number 21. $9. 67 million. Number 22. $9. 3 million. In the first 3 days, Titanic accumulated a box office of $29. 18 million. Chapter 8:22. Titanic has failed at the box office, earning US $29. 18 million in the first weekend. The total box office in North America may not exceed 100 million. Eric Williams' movie magic has failed, epic blockbuster off to a dismal start. Firefly Pictures has suffered the largest box office failure in Hollywood history, with a cumulative loss of nearly 200 million US dollars. Word of mouth can't be stopped, box office is low. Titanic's box office in North America is not as good as Star Trek, First Contact's in the same period. The difference in production costs is 5 times. James Cameron led the team of Titanic to a promotional event in London. He looked haggard at the press conference, suspected of having a mental breakdown. Firefly Group's CEO, Jeffrey Katzenberg, has announced that Firefly Pictures will not fire Titanic's producers, John Landau, William Stewart, and other main creators. They will continue to work with director James Cameron. Eric Williams has not appeared in public for many days. Casino Royale's post-production may have been halted. The film may follow in Titanic's footsteps. On December 23, the day before Christmas, with the release of Titanic's 3-day box office data, the North American entertainment media launched a new round of bombardment on topics related to the film. If it were any other film, it would not be a failure if it earned US $29.18 million in the first 3 days. However, it was Titanic, the most expensive film in history, with a total investment of US $265 million and a global box office of US $800 million to break even. However, Titanic's box office was only US $29.18 million in the first weekend, which was not even comparable to Star Trek: First Contact, which was released the week before. Star Trek: First Contact, which was produced and distributed by Paramount Pictures, cost US $45 million to produce and earned US $30.71 million in the first weekend. The next weekend's box office only dropped 42%, earning US $17.8 million. The cumulative box office in the first 10 days of release had reached US $60 million. Most media outlets had made predictions. Although Titanic's reputation had improved compared to before it was released, due to the long 3-hour film length, most of the audience had lost their motivation to watch the movie. Titanic's box office next week was likely to drop more than Star Trek: First Contact by more than 50%. According to this box office trend, the total box office of Titanic in North America might only be $80 to $90 million US. As everyone knew, the overseas release of Titanic was also blocked by many obstacles. There were only 9 overseas countries where the film was released at the same time, which was less than half of the number of countries where Mission Impossible 2 was released at the same time a month ago. The failure of Titanic at the North American box office would also affect the film's overseas box office. As the enthusiasm of distributors and cinemas in countries where the film was not released decreased, the global box office of Titanic may stop below $200 million US. With a global box office of $200 million, Firefly could only recoup about $70 million US. Future income from videotapes/DVDs, TV broadcast rights, and other income were even more impossible to talk about. The media estimated that Firefly would lose $200 million US from this movie, and it was not an exaggeration. Even within Firefly, most of the management had no choice but to accept this reality. If it was any other major Hollywood film company, after the box office of Titanic was released, facing a huge loss of up to $200 million US, the relevant person in charge would have been kicked out at this time. The entire studio might even face bankruptcy and reorganization. However, of course, it was impossible for Firefly to do this. After all, Titanic was a project that Eric himself had forcefully promoted. It seemed too difficult to fire their own boss. Although they did not need to account to Wall Street or the company's shareholders like other film companies, in the face of the upcoming huge loss, the company's senior management still had to make some adjustments and deal with the aftermath to avoid repeating the mistakes of Titanic in the future. Just after Christmas, although the holiday was not over yet, Katzenberg began to gather the group's film department executives every day to discuss the company's future production and distribution strategy. It could be said that after the box office of the first weekend was released, most people had already labeled Titanic as destined to fail. Coupled with the fact that it was Christmas, very few people paid special attention to the movie's one-day box office. Even the distribution department within Firefly that was responsible for box office statistics was puzzled by Eric's insistence that they report the daily box office summary as soon as possible. Could it be that the boss was still expecting a miracle? Although they were puzzled, no one dared to perfunctorily answer Eric's request. Early every morning, the box office statistics of the day before would appear in Eric's email. Perhaps it was out of consideration for Eric's mood, the women did not mention anything about the movie in front of him these days. Other than the routine holiday greetings, the senior management of Firefly did not mention Titanic to Eric during Christmas. Therefore, this Christmas was lively and warm. In the blink of an eye, it was December 27th, the third day after Christmas. Eric woke up early in the morning as usual. After washing up, he went to the study. Today was Friday, the first day of Titanic's release week. Turning on the computer on the desk and waiting for it to turn on, Eric looked at the white writing board on the wall of the study. At this time, 7 sets of data, including the midnight release, had appeared on it. Needless to say, last weekend was the beginning of this week. December 23rd, $5.57 million. Because it was Monday, compared to the $9.3 million the day before. There was a 40% drop, which was in line with the box office trend of most movies. December 24th, $3.5 million. On Christmas Eve, basically no one would go out to watch movies, so it was not surprising that the box office dropped sharply again. Then, on December 25th, Christmas Day, the box office was $7.03 million. The box office on December 24th, Christmas Eve, was not much of a reference. Compared to the box office on December 23rd, there was a significant increase on December 25th. Yesterday morning, when he saw this number, Eric's mood, which had been a little irritable recently, suddenly relaxed a lot. However, he was not too excited. Just as people would not go out to watch movies on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day was usually a great time for people to go out to eat, drink, and have fun. The box office on this day increased. It was hard to say whether it was because of the movie itself or because of the holiday atmosphere. Therefore, on December 26th, which was yesterday, the box office data of the last day of the first week of Titanic was particularly important. The box office on this day would also prove whether Titanic, after a week of word-of-mouth fermentation, could regain its former glory. If the box office on this day fell again and was the same as the $5.57 million box office on Monday, then all expectations would be in vain. If the box office rose, even if it was the same as Christmas Day, then it would indicate that the ship that created an unprecedented box office miracle in the original spacetime would set sail again. Eric stared at the writing board on the wall for a moment. The computer on the desktop had been turned on. In the process of entering the password to open the Yahoo email, although Eric felt that he had roughly adjusted his mentality these days, at this time, he found that he could not be indifferent. He even felt that his fingers were trembling with excitement because of the arrival of some kind of judgment moment. The page opened, and the eye-catching unread email from the Firefly distribution department lay quietly in the mailbox. Eric moved the mouse and gently tapped on the email to open it. The first thing that appeared in front of him was the total box office of the first week calculated by the distribution department. Eric directly skipped the $54.33 million figure and looked down. Quietly staring at the page, after a few seconds of silence, Eric took a deep breath, got up and walked to the writing board. He picked up the pen and quickly wrote the last number of the first week of Titanic. $9.05 million. This Thursday's box office number, compared to the first day of Titanic, was up 4%. Compared to Christmas Day, it was up 11%. Compared to the most comparable Monday, it was up 38%. Eric couldn't help but glance at the 7-day box office numbers again. $8.65 million, $9. $67 million, $9. $3 million, $5. $57 million, $3. $5 million, $7. $03 million, $9. $05 million. The $3.5 million box office seemed to be a freezing point, but in Eric's view, it was more like a spring that was compressed to the extreme. It gathered all its strength and threw a movie that was destined to represent a miracle into the sky. Titanic officially set sail. Throwing the pen into the pen holder, Eric walked out of the study, thinking that maybe there was no need to record the daily box office. How tiring would that be? A new day. Although it was Friday in Hollywood, it was also a new week. Many people woke up from their sleep and inadvertently looked at today's newspaper. They might have noticed the box office numbers of Titanic in the first week. However, for this movie that had been characterized as a failure by most media, except for more fans who were touched by the movie, most people didn't think that the $54.33 million figure was a big deal. After all, Mission Impossible 2 last month had a box office of more than $80 million in the first week. Los Angeles. Although it was 3 hours later than New York, Katzenberg saw the box office statistics for the first week of Titanic almost at the same time as Eric. Of course, he also noticed the unexpected and even somewhat doubtful US $9.05 million box office on the last day of the first week. Initially, Katzenberg even thought that the distribution department had calculated the numbers wrongly. After all, How could the box office on a weekday be higher than on the first day of release? Although it was the Christmas holiday, most people still had the habit of watching movies on the weekend. Katzenberg called the staff in charge of the box office statistics to confirm. Listening to the voice of the person in charge of the distribution department on the phone, Katzenberg was certain that the number was correct. However, Katzenberg didn't think in a more optimistic way. Instead, he thought that this number was the result of the Christmas holiday effect. After all, December 26th was only the second day of Christmas. Later, the executives of other Hollywood film companies, who were also paying close attention to Titanic, also noticed the box office on December 26th. Most people didn't want to delve into it. Even some sharp-witted media had the same idea as Katzenberg. Although Katzenberg felt that this was just an accident, he still immediately called Eric, who was in New York, and reported the good news. After all, the box office predicted that the North American box office would be $80 million to $90 million, but it unexpectedly earned $34.33 million in the first week. The original forecast would definitely be higher. It was almost certain that the box office would exceed $100 million in North America. Katzenberg felt that it was always good to lose less money. Eric didn't tell Katzenberg about his judgment. He wanted to give everyone a surprise. If God wasn't joking with him, then the surprise would only come tomorrow. After talking to Eric on the phone, Katzenberg said goodbye to his wife and twin sons and drove to the Firefly headquarters in Burbank. He had an appointment with Kenneth Horn, the president of New Line Cinema, this morning to discuss the production and distribution plan of New Line Cinema next year. This year, New Line Cinema almost achieved the same box office performance as Firefly Pictures and Disney Pictures. Coupled with the box office failure of Titanic, starting next year, the corporation would definitely need to increase its support for New Line Cinema. During the discussion over the past few days, Katzenberg, Frank Wales, and other senior executives had decided on a plan to increase the average annual film production budget of New Line Cinema to $500 million for the next 3 years. Eric also agreed to this plan on the phone. Today, they were going to discuss the details in more detail. As for the two major production companies, Katzenberg and Frank Wales, they wanted to reduce the budget of big films. In fact, they wanted to reduce the production scale of Firefly Pictures. At the same time, they wanted to refocus on the development of Disney's live-action films. After all, Disney's entire industrial chain, from the surrounding stores to Disneyland, needed a large number of live-action films to provide enough peripheral goods and copyrighted images. This wasn't just limited to animated films. Live-action films were also important. Eric was not as busy as Katzenberg. After breakfast, he leisurely left the manor with a book and walked to a coffee shop on the edge of the community. There were not many customers in the coffee shop in the morning. Eric greeted the old man behind the counter, who was also bored and flipping through the newspaper, and sat in his usual seat. A waitress brought Eric a cup of coffee and left the room quietly. Eric took a sip of the warm coffee and leisurely opened the Financial Alchemy book in his hand. The old man behind the counter, who had always been silent, took the initiative to speak for the first time. Eric, it seems that the box office of Titanic in the first week is not bad. The old man, who looked to be in his 60s, was named Matthew Braga, the owner of this coffee shop. However, Eric knew that the old man also had a manor of similar size not far from his home. The old man was originally from Brazil and was a very famous local entrepreneur. His family ran a large natural rubber business in northeastern Brazil. At this time, he had handed over the family business to his children. He retired with his wife in the United States. Opening such a coffee shop was more for leisure. After all, the two were not familiar with each other. Eric couldn't reveal anything to him. He replied with a smile, "If it was other movies, of course, it would be good, but this is Titanic. I might lose a lot of money this time. Otherwise, I wouldn't be hiding here now." Matthew Braga laughed, but there was a hint of shrewdness in his eyes. He said, "I've never seen you fail before." "I hope so." After saying this, both of them became quiet again. Eric continued to read the boring financial book in his hand, while Matthew Braga continued to flip through his newspaper. After about an hour, a blonde Caucasian girl in a white down jacket hurriedly pushed the door open and walked in. When she saw that Eric was already sitting there, she quickly walked over and apologized. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Williams. My car broke down, and I had to ask my classmate to send me here." "It's okay, Sabrina. Please take a seat. I happen to have some questions that I need you to help me explain." "Oh, of course." Sabrina Rand sat down opposite Eric. She took out the book, Financial Alchemy, that was identical to Eric's from her bag. She also had a notebook with her. Then, she patiently explained many of the seemingly simple financial questions to Eric. Of course, these questions were only simple for a graduate student in the Department of Finance at Columbia. Because of the recent turmoil in his mind, Eric was not in the mood to sort out the plot of the Marvel comic universe. Instead, he chose to read a boring financial book to pass the time. The cold financial theory was also easier to calm down. However, if it was a Chinese book, it would be easier to understand some things based on the literal meaning. However, if one wanted to understand a professional financial book in English, one would have to know all kinds of professional and even rare financial English words like the back of one's hand. At most, Eric only had some basic financial knowledge in his mind. Therefore, in order to understand this book, he specially hired a top financial student from Columbia University. That student was Sabrina Rand, a tall blonde girl with a pretty face. Eric had no lack of beautiful girls around him. Of course, he did not have any ulterior motives toward the girl in front of him. The reason why he chose Sabrina from the candidates recommended by Columbia was purely because he wanted to add to his charm. Having a beautiful girl as his study companion would definitely make him feel more comfortable than having a girl of the same sex. As for the financial alchemy book that Eric was interested in recently, it had a famous author named George Soros. Chapter 8:23. Sabrina picked up her coffee and took a sip. She carefully looked at the young man sitting opposite her again. She saw that Eric's eyes were focused on his book. Even though half a month had passed, her eyes were still filled with curiosity. Half a month ago, Sabrina, who was looking for a part-time job during the holidays, received a call from her teacher, who was very reputable in the college. He said that a big shot was looking for a temporary tutor to teach him some basic knowledge about finance. He only needed 3 hours a day in the morning, and he would be paid $200. The higher the university in the United States, the higher the tuition fees. This was one of the main reasons why almost half of the college students in the United States dropped out of school. Other than a few rich kids, most of the college graduates in the United States would more or less take on some student loans. In order to alleviate the financial pressure, many students would choose to work part-time while in school. It was the same for Sabrina. Before this, most of her part-time jobs only paid about $10 an hour. When she heard that she could earn $200 for 3 hours a day, Sabrina could not wait to prepare her resume and submit it to the tutor. However, she did not have high expectations. Although her results in the college were not bad, there were plenty of competitors who were more outstanding than her and wanted to get this job. 2 days later, however, she received a notice that she had gotten the job. After that, she met a senior executive of the Firefly Group who was a vice president. His name seemed to be Alan Fissman. She thought that he was the person she was supposed to tutor. However, it turned out that he was only here to interview her. The two of them chatted casually for half an hour. After that, she was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement that was more than 10 pages long. For a senior executive of the Firefly Group who was a vice president to appear for such an insignificant temporary job, Sabrina vaguely realized that something was up. However, when she finally saw Eric in person, Sabrina was so shocked that her jaw almost dropped. Her workplace was in Southampton, which was more than 100 kilometers away from Columbia University in Manhattan. For this temporary job, Sabrina specially stayed at a classmate's house in Bridges City, which was not far from Southampton. Every morning, she would drive half an hour to this cafe in Southampton. In the first few days, Sabrina spent most of her time explaining a lot of basic knowledge to Eric. She mainly explained the professional terms in the book, Financial Alchemy, written by the financial tycoon George Soros, such as reflexivity, participatory bias, swaps, etc. These questions were very basic for most students who majored in finance. Although Sabrina did not dare to express it, she would occasionally feel a sense of superiority. However, as the days passed, Eric's questions became fewer and fewer. However, they also became more and more tricky. There were a few times when Sabrina was almost speechless. However, recently, Sabrina felt like she was becoming more and more like a vase. Other than the first few questions that Eric asked every day, most of the time, he would just read quietly by himself. Occasionally, he would think, or he would be in a daze. Perhaps, in a few days' time, she would lose this well-paid job. At this moment, when she thought of her initial sense of superiority, Sabrina could not help but feel that she was really stupid. The young man in front of her, who had the most personal wealth in the world, was only 2 years older than her. Sabrina could imagine that in 2 years' time, she would at most be able to get a stable job. She would still be miles away from her previous life goal. However, the young man in front of her had already broken through the limits of wealth that most people could have. How much money did he have? 46.5 billion US. No, that was the year before last. Last year, it seemed to be 67.7 billion US. She felt so helpless. After spending more than half a month together, Sabrina would occasionally have thoughts of Cinderella or Cinderella. For this reason, she had been paying special attention to her appearance during this period of time. She had even bought a brand new set of cosmetics. However, until now, other than the book, Financial Alchemy, Eric had not communicated much with her. She had not even been to his place of residence. He must have lived nearby. The two of them could only meet in this cafe every day. Occasionally, when he did not come over, someone would inform her to leave. Sabrina noticed that Eric's gaze had once again left the book and started to wander off. After a pause, she suddenly mustered up her courage and said, "Hey, Eric, last night, I went to watch Titanic with my friends." After saying this, Sabrina noticed that Eric's expression froze for a moment. He raised his head and seemed to have just noticed that there was someone sitting opposite him. Immediately, a faint smile appeared on his face. It was a smile that seemed to see through everything. Sabrina felt her cheeks heating up. She felt an inexplicable sense of regret. However, since she had spoken, she still insisted on blurting out the thoughts that she had been mulling over for a while. She said, "My friends, and I think that this movie has been seriously underestimated. Its box office should have been higher." Eric nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for your affirmation, Sabrina. I'm glad that you like this movie." After Eric finished speaking, he picked up the book in front of him and looked at the page again. Her attempt to strike up a conversation had ended in failure. However, Sabrina felt much more relaxed. She no longer had the courage to take the initiative to speak again. They continued on like this until noon. Sabrina packed up her things. Eric stood up as well. The two of them walked out of the cafe together. Sabrina was about to say goodbye to Eric and head to the nearby road to see if she could flag down a taxi or hitch a ride home. However, she was stopped by Eric's outstretched hand. "Wait a moment. I'll get someone to send you back," Eric said. Sabrina was stunned for a moment and nodded subconsciously. However, she felt an inexplicable warmth in her heart. In the morning, she had casually mentioned that her car had broken down. She did not expect him to remember it. Before this, she had always thought that he was a cold person. She suddenly felt that she had wronged him. Eric took out his phone and dialed a number. The two of them waited by the roadside outside the cafe. Sabrina quietly carried her bag. After pausing for a while, she made up her mind and said, "Eric, you might not need me anymore. Maybe I don't need to come over tomorrow?" Eric looked at the girl and asked, "You still have a long vacation, right? Do you have anything else to do?" Sabrina thought for a while and shook her head honestly. "Then continue reading with me." Eric smiled and said, "I like to have someone by my side when I'm reading. Also, you smell very nice." Sabrina blushed and said, "Eric, there should be many girls around you who are willing to read with you, right?" "Yes." Eric nodded. However, they won't explain to me what the reflexivity theory is. Then, Sabrina asked carefully again, Eric, may I ask why you are interested in Mr. Soros' book? Eric answered ambiguously, something is going to happen, so I want to understand it in advance. Sabrina saw that Eric did not intend to explain to her in detail, so she tactfully did not ask further. It was not until half a year later, when the world-shocking economic crisis engulfed Southeast Asia, that Sabrina understood what Eric meant. The driver drove the car over. Eric instructed him to send Sabrina back to Bridges before he returned to the manor. Surprisingly, Chris and Emily had already rushed over. The two of them had gone back to Maryland to accompany Jeffrey during the Christmas holidays. He did not expect them to return so soon. Eric hugged the two of them and chatted casually. Chris noticed the book, Financial Alchemy, in Eric's hand. He smiled and said, "You recently hired a girl just to read this book with you?" Eric nodded and did not forget to joke. "This news has already spread to Maryland?" Emily heard about it when she was talking to Joan on the phone, Chris explained. However, Emily teased with a smile, "Who knows what he's up to this time?" Eric ignored Emily's teasing and asked, "Why are you back so early? Why don't you stay for a few more days? Isn't it because of you? You pushed so much work to Chris while you were so relaxed." Eric sized Emily up from head to toe, making her hair stand on end. He then said, "If you marry Chris now, I'll immediately take away half of his work." When Emily heard this, she was immediately KO'd. She pulled Virginia, who was beside her, and walked toward the villa. She did not forget to explain, "We'll go prepare lunch. You two can chat." Everyone laughed softly. After the women left, Chris returned to the book, Financial Alchemy, and said, "You've also noticed Soros' actions recently?" Soros did not keep his comments about Southeast Asia's economy a secret. How can I not notice it? Southeast Asia's economic crisis started in 1997. But in fact, Soros had started to talk about Southeast Asia's economy since the start of this year. But just like the UK a few years ago, sterling, which had been strong for hundreds of years, will not depreciate. Now, Southeast Asia, which had experienced more than a decade of false prosperity, also felt their financial system will not be destroyed by international hot money. That's why they did not take any measures to prevent this from happening. Some impatient international currency speculators might have started to short Southeast Asia's currencies. Eric remembered that in February next year, Soros had started to test Thai baht. Chris couldn't help but think of the incident in 1990. He asked, "What do you think this time?" Eric shrugged and said, "Southeast Asia will be in big trouble this time. They will not be able to hold on for much longer." Chris's eyes flashed and asked, "Then what should we do this time? I have been thinking about this recently." Eric said, "We will not be able to replicate the miraculous futures profits during the Kuwait War. That was a sudden super black swan event. Almost no one thought Saddam would dare to invade Kuwait, but he still did. This time, it is different. Once Soros leads the attack on Southeast Asia's currency market, it will be a long tug of war. At that time, the amount of international hot money involved will be more than 100 billion. We will not have any advantage over whoever enters the market, and the risk we will bear will not be lower than others." "Then what are you going to do?" Chris asked. "Let's just play around with a few $100 million. Although we can't play too big, we can't just do nothing. That's not my style." These days, Eric had been thinking about the upcoming economic crisis in Southeast Asia. He had thought of doing something big like he did 5 years ago, but he realized it was impossible. The reason was simple. With Firefly Group's current foundation, Eric could easily raise $2 billion in a short period of time. If necessary, Firefly Group could also borrow more than $1 billion in a short period of time from major banks in the United States. Ideally, with $2 billion and 5 times the safety leverage, Feng Yu's short position in Southeast Asia's currencies will reach $10 billion. In his memory, after the financial crisis, the currencies of the Southeast Asian countries basically depreciated by about 50%. At that time, Eric's short position of $10 billion would be able to earn about $5 billion. $5 billion USD was already a very generous profit figure. After all, the top few corporate giants in the United States only made this amount of profit in a year. However, in Eric's memory, the four tigers of Asia, which suffered the most from the financial crisis in Southeast Asia, only had a little more than $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves. Currency speculation was different from international futures. The investors were mainly the banks of the countries that were attacked, and the source of funds was the foreign exchange reserves of the countries. Then, not to mention the later plundering of the stock market, bonds, and even the real economy of various countries, just in terms of currency speculation, there was only a total of more than $100 billion of fat meat. Under the situation of being surrounded by wolves, it was impossible for Eric to establish a short position of $10 billion no matter what. You want to use $2 billion as your capital to swallow 1/10 of it? Do you think the international hot money of more than $100 billion doesn't exist? In the Southeast Asia financial crisis in the original spacetime, Soros bet all his money and only made a little more than $2 billion in the end. Therefore, perhaps those small investors, in the upcoming financial crisis, could take a risk and reap several times the profit. However, when the scale of the hot money reached a certain level, the profit ratio would greatly decrease. In the end, it would be considered good if they could get 20% or 30% of the profit. P.S. Everyone turn on the air conditioner together. The transformer on the street is on fire. So, the laptop should have automatically shut down after I got distracted. Fortunately, I prepared a USB demodulator power cable, so I was able to connect to the internet. The tiredness that had accumulated on Phil Ropolos's face due to this arduous task that required him to stay up all night had completely disappeared. He lightly flicked the paper in his hand, releasing a rustling sound. He looked at his companion and said, "Do you think there's still a need? How about we give Mr. Thompson a call first?" George Laker suggested again, "I feel a little uneasy about sending this data directly to the bosses." The Robert Thompson that George Lake was talking about was their immediate boss, the president of Firefly's distribution department. Phil Ropolos looked at the box office data of Titanic in his hand again. $12 million. In the first week of Titanic release, there was no single day where the box office exceeded $10 million. This was also one of the reasons why everyone thought Titanic was a box office failure. According to the normal box office trend of most films, the box office of Titanic should be around $6 million this weekend, but at this time, the data in his hands was actually twice the expected. What did this mean? In the second week of Titanic, not only did the box office not decline, but it also skyrocketed. It was not that Phil Ropolos had never seen a box office decline. Many films that had a strong reputation would have a certain degree of increase in the box office in the second week of release, but the increase was basically very small and rarely exceeded 10%. However, compared to the $65 million box office last Friday, the box office of Titanic this Friday was a full 40% higher. Then, let's make a call first. In the end, Phil Ropolos, who was also a little guilty, nodded in agreement with George Lake's words. Therefore, before 7 o'clock in the morning, Firefly Group, including Katzenberg, Frank Wells, Carolyn Elliott, Kenneth Horn, and a group of senior executives in Los Angeles, rushed to the headquarters in Burbank. Even Michael Lynn, who had already resigned and only had a board seat at Firefly, heard the news and curiously rushed to Burbank from his mansion in Malibu. Robert Thompson, the president of Firefly's distribution department, pushed the door open and walked into the conference room. The people who were whispering all quieted down and looked at him in unison. "Mr. Katzenberg, and everyone, I have personally called to confirm. Although there may be some errors, the box office of Titanic yesterday should be around $12 million. After a pause, Robert Thompson added again, "In other words, compared to last Friday, the box office of Titanic not only did not decline, but it increased by $3.5 million, which is 40%. As Robert Thompson spoke, He signaled the secretary behind him to distribute the photocopied box office data report to all the senior executives present. Katzenberg took the detailed data report and couldn't wait to read it. Preliminary statistics showed that on December 27, the box office in the US was $29.5 million. Titanic took the top spot with a box office of $12 million. In second place was Warner Brothers' satirical comedy A Mess of Three Presidents, which was released this week, with a box office of $5.7 million. Next were films such as The Martians, Mr. Sweetheart, and Star Trek: First Contact. Since the detailed daily box office rankings had already been calculated, the data had to be correct. Staring at the box office data of $12 million, Katzenberg didn't feel any excitement. He was just a little confused. He raised his head and looked around. All the senior executives present had the same expression. They all had the same question on their faces. What happened? After a while, Katzenberg looked at Robert Thompson and asked, "Did you send the box office data to Eric?" "Yes, Jeffrey. We send the box office data to Mr. Williams every day before 6 o'clock in the morning," Robert Thompson nodded and confirmed. "Then he—" Katzenberg shook his head halfway through his sentence. If Eric had any feedback, he would definitely have called him or Frank and the others. With that in mind, Katzenberg was no longer in a hurry to understand Eric's reaction. Instead, he looked at everyone. "So, everyone, what's the situation now?" Everyone looked at each other and didn't know what to say. Seeing that no one spoke, Robert Thompson, who was sitting at the end of the desk, said tentatively, "I think the current box office trend of Titanic was already showing signs a few days ago." Hearing Robert Thompson speak, Frank Wales looked over and said, "Robert, can you explain in detail?" "Of course." Robert Thompson nodded. He thought for a while and pointed at the writing board behind Katzenberg. After getting permission, he got up and walked over. He picked up a pen and listed the box office data of the week before Titanic that he had just seen in the box office statistics report. "Everyone, look." Robert Thompson listed the data of the first 7 days of the first week and added yesterday's $12 million. Then, he said to everyone, the opening weekend of Titanic was indeed very mediocre, and there was a normal drop on Monday of the first week. However, since Christmas, Wednesday was $7.03 million, Thursday was $9.05 million, and Friday, which was yesterday, $12 million. From the box office figures of these 3 days, Titanic experienced an initial mediocre trend. Due to certain reasons, the box office began to show an obvious increase. Katzenberg, Frank Wales, Michael Lynn, and other executives who had worked in the film industry for many years roughly understood what Robert Thompson meant by certain reasons. However, as the group's chief financial officer who had just joined Firefly a few years ago, Carolyn Elliott was a little confused. She asked curiously, "Robert, what do you mean by certain reasons?" Robert Thompson glanced at everyone and hesitated. He said, "I think it's most likely the movie's reputation. This is not a relatively polarized reputation in the media, but a word-of-mouth reputation among the audience. However, the box office trend of Titanic is also very different from the word-of-mouth movies in the past. Those movies may have a reverse drop in the next week, but it's definitely not as exaggerated as Titanic. Therefore, I can't guarantee that there are other reasons we don't know." Everyone discussed it for a while. Seeing that this closed-door discussion could not produce any useful results, Katzenberg waved his hand to stop everyone's discussion. He said to Robert Thompson, "Robert, you'll be personally responsible for this matter. I'll give you 3 days to figure out what happened. Also, help me get through to Eric immediately." The news of the dramatic drop in the box office of Titanic next week could not be hidden for too long. In just one morning, most people had already received the relevant information. Of course, Eric was the first to receive the news. However, because of his experience in his previous life, Eric never worried about the box office prospects of Titanic before the release of Titanic, like Katzenberg, Cameron, and others. Correspondingly, the box office of Titanic began to take off the next week. It was difficult for Eric to understand the relief and excitement of the group's senior executives. After receiving a call from Katzenberg, Eric was still sitting in a coffee shop in Southampton. He was quietly reading George Soros' Financial Alchemy with the company of the Vase Girl. After all, this was only the first day of the next week. The follow-up box office data had not been confirmed yet. Eric was not in a hurry to let Katzenberg carry out some of the plans he had been brewing in his mind recently. The two just chatted for more than 10 minutes. After hanging up the phone, Eric called Cameron, who was promoting Titanic in Australia. Although it was early in the morning in Australia, Cameron was not resting. Eric told the news of the box office of Titanic next week to this guy who had been anxious recently. Presumably, Cameron, who was in Sydney, should be able to sleep well. The release of the box office data of Titanic this Friday only made the Firefly Group's senior executives a little confused. When the box office data of the film was released 3 days later, the entire North American media was in a temporary state of confusion. Almost all the media asked the same question: what happened? After the $12 million box office on Friday, the box office on Saturday did not show any signs of decline. Instead, it rose slightly to $12.46 million. Then, the box office on Sunday was $10.86 million. In the end, the 3-day box office of Titanic this weekend totaled $35.44 million. Compared to the $29.18 million box office of the first weekend, it was an increase of more than $600. Although the overall increase was not as terrifying as Friday's, the percentage of decline was still more than 20%. Immediately after, under Katzenberg's personal instructions, Robert Thompson also came up with a preliminary box office survey report. At this time, the reviews of Titanic by the mainstream media in North America no longer had any reference value. Robert Thompson directly hired a professional survey and evaluation agency. In 3 days, he directly collected 20,000 audience questionnaires in major cities in the United States. The results of the survey showed that more than 20% of the audience who watched Titanic next week were watching the movie for the second time. 30% of the audience went to the cinema to watch the movie under the strong recommendation of their relatives and friends. Although most of the audience felt that the 3-hour length of Titanic was the biggest obstacle for them to go to the cinema before watching the movie, more than 80% of the audience found that they had completely ignored the issue of time during the movie. In other words, the movie's outstanding special effects, plot, and rhythm made them completely forget the passage of time. At the same time, according to the 10-point scoring system, the most direct score from the audience actually reached a surprising number of 8 points, far exceeding the previous average of 7 points from the media. The reputation of Titanic among the audience also achieved a reversal. Chapter 825. Initially, when the 3-day box office of Titanic was announced to be less than $30 million in the first weekend, almost all forecasting agencies believed that the North American box office of this mega blockbuster with a total investment of $265 million would probably not exceed $90 million. But in fact, it only took 10 days for the box office of Titanic to reach $69 million, which was only one step away from $90 million. This made most of the media's predictions a week ago instantly become a joke. The $44 million box office of Titanic in the first 3 days of the second weekend made all the media who had been cynical about Titanic shut their mouths. On the second working day, because it happened to be the new year, coupled with the further spread of the word of mouth of Titanic and the publicity effect of the box office of the next week, the box office of Titanic on the second working day only fell by less than 30% compared to the weekend. The box office for the 2 days before and after New Year's Day once again returned to the level of $10 million per day. After the second week, Firefly Group immediately announced the box office of Titanic for the second week, which was $52 million. With the excellent box office performance on weekdays, the box office of Titanic in the second week fell by an astonishing 35% compared to the first week. What kind of concept was this? In the North American film market, if a film's decline in the next week's box office could maintain about 35%, the studio would be very satisfied, because this meant that the film's word of mouth and box office were very good, and it had been a commercial success. As for those films that could maintain the same box office as the first week, or even achieve a slight reversal, they were all box office blockbusters that could leave their names in the film and television industry. A film company might not encounter such a godlike blockbuster in 10 or 20 years, or even until they went bankrupt. But now, the box office trend of Titanic had completely broken everyone's traditional understanding of the box office curve. Most people, whether inside or outside Hollywood, would have a strong sense of confusion in their hearts when they saw the next week's box office data of Titanic. Shouldn't it have fallen by 35%? No matter how strong the mental power of millions of people was, it could not change the fact that Titanic did achieve a 35% reversal in the box office in the second week, reaching $73.52 million in the first week and a two-week box office of $127 million. However, everything had just begun. The new year, January 3rd, Friday. According to the time division rules of the North American film market, this was the first week of the 1997 year. At the end of the two-week legal holiday, Titanic's weekly box office also fell immediately, dropping to $45.01 million, a drop of 38%. When everyone thought that the box office curve of the film was beginning to return to normal, Titanic's box office declined again, in the fourth week, to 16%, it was reduced to $37.56 million. At this time, the four-week box office of Titanic had reached $210.34 million. In comparison, a month ago, Mission: Impossible 2, which opened with a strong first-week box office of $82.7 million, only had a four-week box office of $181.3 million. Moreover, after 4 weeks of screening, Mission: Impossible 2's box office had fallen to about $20 million. Titanic, however, still maintained a huge potential box office of $40 million. After half a month of confusion, doubts, and silence, as the total box office of Titanic exceeded $200 million, the North American media finally began to speak. They changed the pessimism and ridicule before the film's release, and instead analyzed the causes and consequences of Titanic's box office success. $200 million in 4 weeks. The box office potential was endless. Although there was still a lot of pressure on the cost, at this point, no one dared to rashly say that Titanic could not recover its production cost. On the other hand, although many film critics who criticized Titanic were still stubborn in the face of the movie's godlike box office trend, as more and more film reviews appeared in newspapers and magazines across the United States, the overall film review of Titanic began to reverse. As the first to express praise for Titanic, the New York Times once again published a special review after the box office exceeded $200 million. The extravagant setting, the shocking and magnificent sunken ship special effects, the beautiful and magnificent soundtrack, the touching love story. All of this reminds me of the sensational Gone with the Wind. There are undoubtedly too many similarities between these two films. Gone with the Wind perfectly recreated the rise and fall of the plantations in the Southern Union more than 100 years ago, and Titanic impeccably showed the terrible disaster of the supposedly unsinkable luxury ship sinking to the bottom of the sea on its first voyage. Gone with the Wind wasn't the first color movie, but it brought Hollywood color movies to their heyday. Titanic wasn't the first CG special effects blockbuster. Before that, we already had Tornado, Terminator, Jurassic Park, Men in Black, and other special effects blockbusters. But there's no doubt that Titanic will also usher in a brand new era for Hollywood, an era of special effects movies. With the reversal of the reputation of the film Titanic, at the end of January, when the Golden Globe Awards ceremony was approaching, the topic of Titanic, only receiving an insignificant Best Screenplay nomination at the Golden Globe Awards, suddenly became a hot topic again, and it caused a strong controversy. Everyone could see that even if Titanic was a commercial film, even if the Golden Globe judges had a cold eye for commercial films, And even if the Golden Globe Awards did not have technical awards, in addition to the Best Screenplay nomination, Titanic undoubtedly had the qualifications to be nominated in the Best Film Soundtrack and Best Original Song categories. The elegant melody of the Scottish whistle in the film, the melancholy of the female singing, and the heavenly sound of "My Heart Will Go On," even the most indifferent people would tremble after hearing these. However, the Golden Globe Awards gave the 2 nominations to Shakespeare in Love, Madame Varenne, and The Shining Light, which were films with mediocre soundtracks and songs, but ignored Titanic. Moreover, in terms of acting awards, even Madonna, who had won the Worst Actress award 3 times, was nominated for Best Actress, but Rachel Weisz, who had an amazing performance in the film, was not favored at all by the Golden Globe Awards. This became an important topic for the media to criticize this year's Golden Globe Awards. There is no doubt that Hollywood once again provided us with a large number of excellent films last year. In terms of business, we have The Matrix, The Mummy 2, Stranger in the Wind, Thunderbolt 2, and other box office hits. In terms of art, we can also see Shakespeare in Love, Red Alert, Cold Blood, The Shining Style, and other excellent films. However, although Shakespeare's Love, Red Alert, Frozen Blood, and The Shining Light have achieved great achievements in the art of film, this is not the reason why Titanic is ignored. Perhaps the Golden Globe Awards committee should reflect on their selection strategy. This review on The Hollywood Reporter was definitely the most moderate. It did not mention the possibility of the Golden Globe Awards being manipulated, but many other media outlets were not so polite. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle bluntly exposed the scars of the Golden Globe Awards. Surely everyone still remembers Pia Zadora in 1982? I'm just very curious. Which financier paid for the Golden Globe judges to completely ignore such an excellent film like Titanic this time? In 1982, the female lead of The Butterfly, Pia Zadora, bought an award. It was definitely the biggest scandal in the history of the Golden Globe Awards. At that time, Pia Zadora's rich husband invested a lot of money to promote his wife's Golden Globe Best Newcomer Award. After the scandal was exposed, not only did it cause the credibility of the Golden Globe Awards to plummet, but CBS also stopped the television broadcast cooperation with the Golden Globe Awards organizers. Later, in order to make people forget as much as possible, the Golden Globe Awards canceled the Best Newcomer Award. The reversal of Titanic's reputation and box office was undoubtedly the most exciting to the film's fans. The audience's perception of a film was the most direct. They clearly remembered the cold reception and ridicule before and at the beginning of the film's release. When the film's reputation and box office showed a strong reversal in recent weeks, the fans, who almost felt the whole process because of their love for Titanic, were in a state of excitement and pride. They paid more attention to all information about Titanic. When the controversy of Titanic's nomination for the Golden Globe Awards broke out, the fans quickly gave the most direct and rude feedback on the rapidly rising internet media in recent years. It's hard to imagine that the 90-odd judges of the Golden Globe Awards could completely ignore all the merits of Titanic. I can only guess that this bunch of old men must have fallen asleep before the movie started. Since you're already so old that you can't even watch movies, what's the point of the Golden Globe Awards? In any case, the excellence of Titanic can't be hidden. The North American box office of this film has exceeded $200 million. It's said that the overseas box office is also very good. So, why should we care about such an insignificant award? Everyone choosing to ignore it is probably the best respect for the Golden Globe Awards. I hope that on January 19th, no one will jump to NBC. Golden Globe Awards. Who cares? Is there anyone here in Queens, New York? Maybe we can buy tickets together and watch it again tonight. I only care about the box office of Titanic now. From the beginning, this was a conspiracy. Some people hoped that Titanic would become a complete failure, so they attacked the film at the Golden Globe Awards. However, Titanic once again proved to us that gold will always shine. Obviously, Titanic is not only gold, but also a diamond. It is the most dazzling heart of the ocean. The boycott of the Golden Globe Awards has begun. Friends who want to support Titanic, please support us. Our campaign URL is, amidst the one-sided doubts and condemnations from the media and the internet, the Golden Globe Awards organizers had to take the initiative to issue an announcement before the award ceremony. They firmly denied all the accusations of the unscrupulous media against the Golden Globe Awards judges and stated that the judging process of the Golden Globe Awards was absolutely fair. The reason why Titanic was not nominated was because there were too many excellent films this year and Titanic's performance in terms of artistic quality was not outstanding. In order to prepare for the Super Bowl trailer of Casino Royale, Eric returned to Los Angeles after the new year. Eric just laughed at the Golden Globe Awards jury statement that was obviously nonsense. Firefly Group did not add fuel to the fire behind the recent media frenzy, and Yahoo even deleted some of the extreme comments against the Golden Globe Awards on the Yahoo forum. After all, even though Titanic wasn't nominated, Catherine's Red Alert and Fox's Miramax's Shakespeare's Love were the two hottest movies of this awards season. As they both belonged to the genre of artistic films that were slow to gain popularity, the distribution strategy of the two films was similar. Currently, they were both in the small-scale stage of showing in 300 to 400 cinemas. It was expected that after the Golden Globe Awards, the screening scale would expand to more than 1,000 cinemas. The two films belonged to the drama category and the musical comedy category respectively. There was no conflict in the main nominations. If they could win an award, it would play a good role in promoting the later box office of the two films. Since Titanic had already become a reality, Eric would not affect the release of these two movies for the sake of a moment of anger. Of course, it was impossible for Firefly to be indifferent to the obvious unfair treatment of Titanic. Although the crew of Titanic received an invitation from the Golden Globe Awards organizers, hoping that they could attend this year's award ceremony, the Golden Globe Awards judges even personally called Eric to invite him. However, Eric still declined with the excuse that he was busy. As for the main creators of Titanic, none of them would attend the awards ceremony that day. Although he was nominated for Best Screenplay, Cameron's resentment towards the Golden Globe Awards was definitely stronger than anyone in the crew. Of course, he would not attend. During the time he returned to Los Angeles, in addition to restarting the post-production work of Casino Royale, Eric also invested a lot of energy in the follow-up work of Titanic. Before the release of the film, there were generally negative opinions in the industry. When Titanic was released in North America, only 9 countries had achieved the same release overseas. In addition to the United Kingdom and Australia, Germany, France, and Italy, which were important box office markets in Europe, had not been released yet. Originally, if Firefly had forced the release of Titanic, with the strong distribution strength of the group, it should have been able to get a big release in the overseas market in January or February. However, this was not what Eric wanted. For the current overseas film markets in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America, the January or February release after the new year was the unpopular period after the holidays. Although it could not stop the destined rise of Titanic, it certainly could not exert enough box office potential. According to the current box office trend of Titanic, Eric estimated that the film would break the North American box office record and the total box office would exceed $500 million at the end of March. At the same time, there was another important event for Hollywood movies in March, which was the Oscars. It was conceivable that as long as it was done properly, March would definitely be the most popular time for Titanic. Therefore, Eric placed the focus of the next stage of the overseas release of Titanic during the Easter period in March. At that time, the global box office of Titanic in this space-time would definitely exceed the $1.8 billion in his previous life due to the strong influence brought about by breaking the box office record and winning the Oscars. The North American box office trend of Titanic had been determined. What Firefly had to do next, of course, was to make sure that Titanic would win enough Oscars. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.